Hello, welcome back to the Phantom Diary channel. I'm sure there are many of you listening to my stories to fall asleep. Before we start, write in the comments what country you're listening from. So, let's go. It was a quiet stretch of highway, miles from the nearest town. My friend Lisa and I were on a road trip, headed home after a long weekend camping in the mountains. As the sun began to set, we realized we were running low on gas. The highway seemed endless, and there were no signs of any open stations. The next town was still hours away. "That's weird," Lisa said as we drove past a bend in the road. "Is that a gas station?" Sure enough, just off the side of the road, half hidden by overgrown grass and rusting fences, stood an old, decrepit gas station. The pumps were covered in layers of grime, and the building itself had collapsed in on itself, windows shattered, walls crumbling. But the neon sign still flickered faintly above the roof. "Open." "Should we stop?" Lisa asked, her voice hesitant. "We don't really have a choice," I said. "Let's see if we can get at least a little gas. It might just be abandoned, but we need something to get us to the next town." We parked the car beside the pumps, both of us keeping a careful distance from the building. The stillness was unsettling. There were no birds, no distant hum of wildlife, just the sound of the wind rustling through the empty surroundings. The door of the gas station had long since fallen off its hinges, so we cautiously stepped inside. It was darker than we had anticipated. The floor was covered in broken glass and bits of drywall, and a heavy layer of dust floated in the air like fog. The shelves were bare, save for a few cans of rusted motor oil and old, tattered magazines. "Hello," I called out, though my voice sounded thin in the oppressive silence. No response. Just the creak of the wooden floorboards beneath our feet. "I don't like this," Lisa whispered, eyes wide. "Me neither," I admitted, pulling my phone out. No signal. It had been lost somewhere back in the mountains, and now it was completely useless here. "Let's just grab some gas and get out." We walked carefully toward the pump station. The rusted metal of the pumps groaned as I started, the handle, the sound, scraping loudly in the quiet. It barely produced a trickle, but we took what we could get. "That's enough," Lisa said, her breath catching in her throat as she turned to me. "Let's go." Just as we reached the edge of the pump, we heard a soft thud from behind, like something had fallen inside the station. A chill ran down my spine. "Did you hear that?" I asked. Lisa nodded quickly. "Something's in there." We hesitated, looking back at the broken windows, the shadowed doorway. For a moment, we were frozen. There was nothing visible in the darkness, no figure, no movement, but the air grew colder and a sense of dread settled in. "I think we should get in the car," I said softly. Before we could move, a soft voice drifted into the night air. "Higatu Shizuk," voice that wasn't quite human but something distorted, almost inhuman. It whispered our names. Lisa. John. From the shadows. We both froze. The voice grew louder, a low, guttural hum, accompanied by dragging footsteps, slow and deliberate, coming from the station. The air felt like it was compressing, suffocating. "Run!" Lisa screamed, grabbing my hand. We sprinted toward the car, heartbeats pounding in our chests. I glanced over my shoulder. Shadows moved within the station. Not human shapes, but something far more terrifying. Twisted, dark shapes clawing their way out from the shadows. The gas station was behind us, collapsing into darkness, but the sound of those footsteps continued, echoing louder with every step we took away. We reached the car just as the first heavy thud shook the ground beneath us, the sound of something large crashing through the debris. Lisa yanked the door open and we sped off down the highway, leaving the ruined station far behind. Neither of us spoke until we were miles down, the road, the world stretching out behind us. But the voice, those whispers, still haunted us, faintly in the distance. It was late summer when we stumbled upon the field. We were driving through rural countryside, miles away from any town, chasing the fading sunlight as it dipped lower toward the horizon. The GPS had failed, and the map we brought along was outdated. The car's engine sputtered as we approached a narrow dirt road, flanked by tall trees on either side. "Are you sure this is the right way?" Emily asked, her voice uncertain as she glanced at the dense foliage creeping closer. "Yeah, there's supposed to be a clearing up ahead," Mark replied, his hands firm on the wheel. The road narrowed, the air growing heavier with every mile. The sun slipped further behind the trees, and the quiet became almost oppressive. After what felt like hours, we finally spotted it. A wide, open field stretching to the horizon. The sky was a deep, ominous gray, though patches of sunlight still broke through the thick clouds. It looked like something out of a dream, or a nightmare. "Let's stop here," Mark said, pulling the car to the side. The tires crunched against loose gravel, and we stepped out into the cool evening air. The silence pressed in on us immediately, unnerving and unnatural. There was no wind, no sound of birds, only the soft rustling of the tall grass in the distance. "Seems peaceful enough," I said, though my voice wavered. "We can't be the only ones out here," Emily murmured, scanning the empty horizon. Began setting up camp near the edge of the field. The air felt thick, almost suffocating, and the shadows stretched unnaturally long. Every sound seemed to come from somewhere unseen. Whispers in the distance, faint voices that faded away as soon as we turned our heads. As the sun dipped below the horizon, casting us into near-total darkness, the whispers grew louder. They weren't coherent, just a jumble of indistinct sounds that slithered into our thoughts. It felt like hundreds of voices all speaking at once, their words twisting into something sinister. "Stop," Mark said sharply, his voice cutting through. "The eerie hum. Can anyone else hear that?" We all nodded in silence. The whispers seemed to come from every direction, weaving in and out of the stillness. Emily shivered, clutching her arms tightly against her chest. Suddenly, the ground beneath us trembled, slightly. The tent poles wobbled and I stumbled backward, my breath catching in my throat. The others turned toward me, panic flickering in their eyes. It was as if the field itself had awakened. Something ancient and malevolent had stirred beneath the surface. "It's the field," I managed to say, my voice barely a whisper. "It's alive." "No way," Mark snapped, shaking his head. "That's impossible." But the evidence was all around us. Shadows began to slither through the tall grass, tangled, twisting shapes that moved faster than we could comprehend. They didn't seem to have a form, only darkness that pulsated with an otherworldly hunger. Emily let out a soft scream as one of the shadows brushed against her arm, cold, sharp, and almost tangible. Her skin turned pale, her body stiffening with terror. The whispers turned into screams, terrifying, shrill as if the very grass were alive, screaming in pain. "Run!" Mark shouted, grabbing Emily's hand. We bolted toward the car, our feet pounding against the uneven earth. The shadows surged after us, creeping impossibly fast, their presence suffocating and oppressive. The field seemed to stretch endlessly, the darkness swallowing everything in its path. The car was in sight, just a few more steps away. I could hear the engine roaring in the distance, Mark desperately trying to start it. Just as we reached the door, I felt a cold hand grasp my shoulder. My scream echoed as I spun around, but no one was there. Only the shadows, deeper and more distorted, closing in around us. The engine sputtered, then roared to life. Mark sped away, leaving the field behind. As the shadows receded into the darkness, we didn't stop until we were miles down the road. Gasping for breath and drenched in sweat, we never went back, and to this day, the whispers still haunt my dreams. It was late afternoon when we arrived at the old forest. We were deep into a remote area, miles away from any towns or well-trodden paths. Our group of friends, 5 of us in total, were on a camping trip, seeking seclusion and adventure. The weather was cool, the trees towering above us, their leaves whispering in the wind. Our destination was an abandoned watchtower, hidden deep within the woods. The locals warned us it hadn't been used in decades, but that only made it more enticing. Rumors spoke of strange occurrences. Whispers echoing from the empty floors, footsteps heard when no one was there, and sudden, bone-chilling drafts that had no explanation. We hiked for hours before we finally found it, a massive, crumbling structure standing atop a hill. The once sturdy wooden steps had rotted away, leaving only a jagged metal frame leading up to the upper platform. Ivy snaked its way up the sides, obscuring much of its age. "I'm not so sure about this," Emma said, looking up at the tower. "Come on," Jake grinned. "It's just a tower. We'll be fine." We carefully climbed the rusted metal stairs, one shaky step at a time. The higher we got, the more unstable the structure felt. Halfway up, the wind howled through the empty beams, making the metal groan beneath our weight. "I'm telling you, something's watching us," Sophia whispered, her voice trembling. "I've been feeling it since we started climbing." "Stop being paranoid," I said, though a part of me wasn't entirely convinced. The feeling of being watched was inescapable, a cold sensation crawling up my spine with each step we took. When we reached the top, the view was breathtaking. The forest stretched for miles, the trees like endless waves of green beneath us. But as we stood there, taking it all in, the air grew colder. The wind seemed to carry a voice, soft yet insistent. "Leave. Leave." It wasn't just in our heads. The whispering voice seemed to come from every direction at once. I looked around frantically, my flashlight shaking in my grip. The others stood frozen, wide-eyed, scanning the forest below. "Who's there?" Jake demanded, his voice sharp and commanding. "Show yourself." The platform beneath us trembled. A loud, metallic groan echoed around us, followed by a deafening silence. The wind stopped. The whispering ceased. It was as though the world held its breath. Suddenly, we heard the soft creak of footsteps. Light, deliberate, as though someone was walking along the narrow metal beam just inches from the edge. My heart pounded, and I realized something was on the platform with us. Sophia whimpered, her voice breaking. It's above us." We all glanced up. A shadowed figure loomed just beyond the rim of the watchtower. It moved with a slow, unnatural grace, its form shifting between solid and misty as if it wasn't fully present in our reality. Its hollow eyes stared down at us, its mouth twitching into a grotesque, silent grin. "Climb down! Now!" I shouted, grabbing Sophia's hand as we scrambled toward the stairs. But as we descended, the figure descended with us. The sound of its footsteps echoed in time with ours, always one step behind, one floor below. At the base of the tower, we stumbled into the forest. The darkness was oppressive, and the wind carried the voice once again. "Leave. Leave." We ran for hours, driven by fear and adrenaline, until we reached the outskirts of the forest. The tower stood far behind us now, its shadow looming in the distance. We never looked back. It was supposed to be a quiet weekend getaway. A group of friends, myself, Emily, and Jake, headed out to a remote cabin deep in the forest. Cell service was spotty at best, and the nearest town was miles away. Perfect for a relaxing break from the city. The cabin itself was small, tucked away at the edge of a dense woods. Weathered wood panels lined the exterior, and the porch creaked ominously with each step. Inside, the place was cozy but old, a collection of mismatched furniture and bookshelves overflowing with dusty, forgotten volumes. There were no other cabins nearby, no signs of human activity for miles. The first night passed without incident. We built a fire, roasted marshmallows, and shared stories of ghost sightings and eerie woods. But it was that night something began to feel off. The following evening, after dinner, we noticed strange things around the cabin. Shadows flickered at the edge of the windows, and the distant sounds of footsteps moved through the forest. Slow, deliberate, but invisible. Jake was the first to mention it. "Do you hear that?" he asked, his voice low. We fell into a tense silence, straining to listen. Faint, hurried movement sounded from just beyond the tree line, branches snapping, under unseen weight. Each step was heavier, as though something massive was approaching, moving deliberately closer to the cabin. "We should have left when we had the chance," Emily whispered, her face pale in the dim glow of the lantern. Suddenly, the noise stopped. Dead silence. The air became unbearably still, and the darkness outside seemed thicker, more oppressive. Every creak of the cabin echoed loudly in our ears, growing more intense by the second. "Whatever's out there, it's not leaving," Jake said, his voice trembling. We huddled together, moving closer to the fire in a desperate bid for warmth. The flames flickered wildly, casting dancing shadows against the wooden walls. Through the cabin's single large window, we could see nothing beyond the darkness. The trees stood motionless, silent sentinels guarding their secrets. Hours passed. The tension became unbearable. I felt like something was watching me from just behind the walls, cold, heavy eyes fixed on my every move. At one point, Jake whispered, "I think it's inside." We froze. He pointed to a sound, a faint tapping on the glass of the window. Small, deliberate, slow, like fingers tracing invisible shapes. The tapping continued for what felt like an eternity, each strike making my heart race faster. "We've got to do something," Emily hissed, her voice barely audible. But just as we rose to investigate, a knock came from the front door. 3 slow, hollow raps. It wasn't Jake's, it wasn't ours. It came from outside, from something, or someone who wasn't supposed to be there. "No way," Jake said, stepping back. "No way anyone else knows about this place." Before we could react, the door handle began to turn, slow, steadily, as though whatever was on the other side had all the time in the world. "Stay back," I yelled, grabbing the heavy fireplace poker, but the door swung open. It revealed nothing. Darkness. Cold air rushed in, and the room felt heavier, as if whatever had knocked had never intended to enter. We were too terrified to speak, too frozen to move. The silence was deafening. Suddenly, from the corner of my eye, I saw something. An outline, just beyond the doorway, standing. In the shadows. It was tall, impossibly tall, its form elongated, unnatural. Its eyes, gleaming white, stared into mine with a haunting stillness. Then, it vanished. The door slammed shut, rattling the entire cabin. We scrambled back into the living room, hearts pounding in our chests. The fireplace flickered for a final time, and in the last burst of light, we saw it, standing again, just beyond the glass of the front window. The creature didn't move. It just watched, its hollow gaze boring into ours. Morning came, and with it, silence. The woods were empty. The only sign we had ever been there was the heavy weight in our chests and the haunting memory of the figure that shouldn't have existed. It was the off-season when we arrived at the carnival. The last visitors had left weeks ago, leaving behind a ghostly silence that hung over the empty grounds. Faded banners flapped in the wind, and the rides stood still, rusting in the moonlight. My friends and I thought it would be a fun, eerie adventure, exploring a place that was supposedly haunted by the forgotten memories of carnival-goers past. We parked a little ways away, near the edge of a deserted road. The air was cool, tinged with the faint scent of dust and cotton candy. The carnival's entrance was still decorated with gaudy, faded lights, flickering intermittently. Every step we took onto the midway, the gravel beneath our feet made a soft, crunching sound, and the emptiness of it all weighed heavier with each passing second. "I don't like this," Alex whispered, his flashlight flickering as we walked toward the Ferris wheel. "It feels like something's watching us." "Don't be ridiculous," Lisa said with a nervous laugh, but even she looked uneasy. "It's just a dead carnival." We wandered through the dark paths, passing by derelict game stalls and carnival tents. The laughter of crowds from long ago echoed faintly in our minds, a memory twisted by time. The sounds of rides creaking and music playing warped into something haunting. The first warning came as we approached the tilt-a-whirl. The lights above the ride flickered, then went completely out. Shadows slithered across the ground, pooling at our feet. Suddenly, there was no wind, no sound, just the oppressive silence. "Hello?" I called out, my voice a whisper, but there was no answer. Then we saw them. At the far end of the midway, a cluster of figures stood still like marionettes frozen in place. They wore tattered carnival costumes, clowns, jokers, ringmasters, all warped and decayed beyond recognition. Their eyes were dark voids, hollow and staring. Lisa gasped. What are they?" "Run!" Alex yelled, his voice breaking as we sprinted toward the exit. But the figures didn't move. They only stared as we fled, their twisted faces etched into our nightmares. We reached the entrance, but the way out was blocked. The gates had shut themselves with no sound, metal grinding against metal. Panic set in. The shadows were closing in on us now, their forms moving as though they were alive, though they made no sound. I stumbled, tripping over uneven ground. My flashlight flickered once more, then died completely. Darkness consumed everything around us. I could hear my friends screaming, their voices swallowed by the oppressive void. Then, a voice whispered, just behind me, "You can't leave." It was soft, guttural, and chillingly close. I spun around, but there was nothing, just shadows, and the twisted figures still standing in the distance. The last thing I saw was their faces, frozen in twisted grins, as the world faded into nothingness. It was past midnight when we took the wrong turn. My friends and I were driving back from a weekend getaway in the mountains, winding through unfamiliar back roads. The sky above was pitch black, and the only sounds in the car were the hum of the tires on the asphalt and the faint rustle of leaves brushing against the windows. "We should have taken that left," Sam said, peering at his phone, its battery flickering dimly. "This road is taking us nowhere." "Let's just keep going for a bit," I suggested, though my voice trembled slightly. There was something unsettling about the way the trees loomed over the narrow road, their branches clawing at the dark sky. We drove for miles, nothing but forest on either side, when the road suddenly twisted into a narrow path. The headlights barely cut through the thick mist that settled at the ground. The temperature dropped instantly, and a strange stillness took over. The air was dense, pressing down on us as if something unseen was watching from the shadows. The GPS signal flickered, cutting in and out. "There's no signal here," Sam said nervously, holding his phone close. "What kind of road is this?" We stopped the car, unsure of what to do next. The forest pressed in on all sides, dark and silent. There wasn't a sound of animals, no rustling leaves or distant howls, just a suffocating silence. "Maybe we should turn back," Emily whispered. Her face was pale, and she kept glancing at the trees as if something might step out of them. "Let's go a little further," Ryan said, his voice calm but eyes wide with unease. "There has to be a way out eventually." We moved forward, the road narrowing until it became little more than a dirt path. The forest encroached more tightly around us, shadows stretching unnaturally across the ground. The headlights flickered again, dimming for a moment before returning to life. Suddenly, we saw them, a row of figures standing just beyond the trees. It was a line of tall, shadowy figures, completely black, with no discernible features, just motionless silhouettes watching us. "Stop the car," I said sharply. "Turn back, now." Ryan hesitated, his hands trembling over the steering wheel. "They're not moving," he said, his voice barely a whisper. What are they? The figures began to move, their slow, deliberate steps creeping closer. No sound accompanied their movement, just the unnerving stillness of their approach. It was like watching ghosts materialize from the darkness itself. "Drive!" Sam yelled, panic evident in his voice. The figures were halfway across the road now, their elongated shapes closing the gap. The car sped forward, tires screeching against the gravel as we broke free from the nightmare. The silhouettes dissolved back into the trees, swallowed by the forest. Behind us, the oppressive silence returned, though a chill lingered in the air, heavier than before. We drove for what felt like hours until we found a sign pointing back toward the highway. A familiar sight. Each mile we put between ourselves and that dark stretch of road eased the suffocation slightly, but the fear remained. None of us spoke until we reached the safety of a nearby town. Even then, the memory of those figures haunted us. Their silence, their slow, deliberate advance. We knew we would never forget. It started as a simple hiking trip with a group of friends. We chose a remote trail deep in the woods, far from any towns or signs of civilization. The sun had just begun to dip behind the trees when we parked our car at the trailhead. The air, crisp and refreshing. The woods were dense. Ancient oaks and towering pines loomed on either side, their branches whispering softly in the wind. At first, the hike was peaceful. The trail was uneven but manageable, with scattered patches of wildflowers and the occasional babble of a distant brook. We kept up a steady pace, chatting and laughing as we made our way deeper into the woods. But as the sun faded, a quiet tension settled over the group. "Do you guys hear that?" Jenny asked, her voice hushed. We paused, listening. The sound was subtle, at first like the rustling of leaves in the breeze, but then it became clearer. A faint whispering, coming from all directions. A low murmur of voices, too distorted to make out, yet unsettling in its insistence. "It's probably just the wind," Matt said, trying to brush it off. But it wasn't the wind. The whispering grew louder with every step, a constant hum beneath the surface of the quiet forest. Every time we paused, the noise would intensify, as if it was circling us, weaving through the trees. The sense of isolation was overwhelming. "Let's head back," Emily said. "This isn't normal." We agreed, but the trail seemed to shift. The path we had come from was nowhere to be seen. We were surrounded by the same towering trees on every side, a maze of dark trunks that felt impossibly endless. "We're lost," Mark whispered. His voice trembled as his flashlight flickered weakly. "No," I said, my voice steadier than I felt. "We must have taken a wrong turn." The whispering grew louder still. It wasn't a language we recognized. It was alien, disjointed, fragmented, yet unmistakably human-like in its tone. The deeper we ventured, the more the trees seemed to close in, their shadows twisting unnaturally against the moonlight. Then, from the darkness, a figure emerged, a silhouette between the trees. It moved effortlessly, fluidly, neither fast nor slow, its form shifting and twisting unnaturally. It had no clear shape, no discernible features, just a dark void in the shape of a person. "Run!" Jenny screamed, but her voice barely escaped her lips before we were already moving. The sound of crunching leaves beneath our feet was drowned out by the sound of that whispering, louder now, more urgent. It seemed to reach out for us, threading through the air like a living thing. We ran blindly, deeper into the woods, hoping to find a clearing, anything that could give us a sense of direction. The figure pursued us silently, its presence never truly fading, just moving alongside us like a shadow. Finally, we burst into a small clearing, a circle of space carved out of the forest. The whispering came to a halt, but the oppressive silence that followed was worse. The figure was still there, just at the edge of the circle, motionless, its form twisted, limbs bending unnaturally before it lifted a hand, elongated and skeletal. and pointed directly at us. A chill ran down my spine as it spoke, not with words but with a thought, a feeling that sank into our minds. You are not welcome here. No, I yelled, backing away, but the figure followed. Every attempt to run was futile. The woods were alive, shifting with the trees, and it was always one step ahead. We had nowhere to go. Suddenly, a distant sound, a faint, low chant, rose from deeper within the woods. It echoed eerily, surrounding us. The whispers began again, louder, more sinister than before, intertwining with the chant. It was a dark, ancient hymn that sent a fresh wave of terror through us. "No!" Mark shouted, his voice cutting through the nightmare. His flashlight flared brightly, forcing the darkness to retreat, even if only briefly. The figure recoiled, its shape momentarily distorted by the light, revealing something grotesque beneath, hulking, misshapen, and monstrous. We didn't stop. We couldn't. The light guided us, pushing back the shadows that threatened to swallow us whole. Every footstep echoed through the night as we fled, away from the cursed woods, away from the whispering evil. When we finally broke free of the trees, we collapsed onto the forest's edge, our lungs heaving, bodies trembling, but alive. We never spoke of what we encountered. No maps led to that place, and no memories could bring it back. The Whispering Woods had claimed their victims once again. It was the dead of night when we reached the old lighthouse. The sea was wild, the waves crashing against jagged rocks below, and the wind howled through the skeletal structure of the lighthouse like a banshee. My friends and I had been road tripping along the coast when we stumbled upon the dilapidated building, an ancient beacon lost to time. The lighthouse stood tall, its once pristine white paint faded to a ghostly gray. A rusty metal staircase spiraled up to the lantern room, now broken and hollow. There was no power, no light, just the sound of the sea, roaring endlessly in the distance. "Why are we even here?" Alex asked nervously, the cold biting through his jacket. "Because it's cool," Mark replied, smirking. "Come on, man. You scared?" "Just something feels off," Alex muttered, glancing around the dark grounds. The area was overgrown, weeds tangled in the cracks of the cobblestone path. The only source of light was a small flashlight, flickering intermittently. "E." We moved closer. The wind picked up again and the shadows seemed to pulse with movement. There were no lights, but it felt like we weren't truly alone. Footsteps echoed in the distance, soft, steady, as if someone else were pacing the grounds. "Who the hell is out here?" Emma asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Her grip on her phone tightened as she scanned the darkness for any sign of movement. "It's just us, right?" "I don't see anyone," I replied, scanning the area with my own flashlight. But there was nothing, only darkness. The air grew colder as we climbed the staircase. Each step groaned beneath our weight, metal straining against rust. The higher we went, the more the wind howled, the sound pressing in on us from all sides. It felt as though we were ascending into some ancient, forgotten realm. When we reached the top, the lantern room was empty. The lens was shattered, glass shards glinting in the faint flashlight beams. The wind howled through the space, sending shivers down our spines. But something else caught my attention. A faint, rhythmic tapping against the cold stone walls. It wasn't the wind. "Did you hear that?" Mark asked, his voice tight. I nodded, uneasy. "Yeah, something's here." Suddenly, the lights flickered, briefly illuminating the room before plunging us back into darkness. The tapping intensified, now almost a scratching sound. It echoed like a heartbeat, steady and measured, coming from deep within the stone. A figure appeared in the shadows, just a faint silhouette, one that seemed to move impossibly fast. "Emma," gasped as the flashlight flickered again. This time, the figure was closer, the darkness itself writhing and shifting around it. I could barely make out its shape. Tall, with gaunt features and hollow eyes, its form distorted as though bending. "Reality itself! Run!" I shouted, but my voice was drowned out by the wind. We bolted down the staircase, but the creature followed, its presence oppressive and all-consuming. The metal groaned beneath our feet, but it felt like nothing could outrun it. When we finally made it to the ground, we didn't stop. We sprinted across the grounds, through the overgrown grass, and didn't dare look back. The creature's whispers cut through the wind, words too twisted to understand, yet they left a chill deeper than any ice. We found the car, slammed the doors shut, and peeled out, leaving the lighthouse behind. The sea calmed as we sped away, the wind dying down, but the memory of those hollow eyes, those whispers, haunted us long after we drove away. The GPS had failed hours ago, and the four of us were hopelessly lost. The back roads wound endlessly through unfamiliar woods, the dense trees blotting out the moonlight. What had started as a fun weekend road trip had turned into something else, entirely, a frantic attempt to find our way back to civilization. As the car rolled along the cracked asphalt, a strange fog began to rise. It clung low to the ground, unnervingly thick, swallowing the road behind us. We hadn't passed another car in miles, and the deeper we went, the more the road seemed to deteriorate. Broken pavement, overgrown weeds creeping up the edges, and signs rusted beyond recognition. "Are we even going the right way?" Claire asked from the passenger seat, her voice strained. "I don't know," I admitted, "but turning back won't help. We have to keep going until we hit a main road." The others in the back, Mike and Tara, were unusually quiet. None of Idus said it aloud, but we all felt it. The oppressive weight of the woods pressing in, the silence broken only by the occasional snap of a branch in the darkness. After another hour of driving, we saw a sign. It was old, the paint faded, but it pointed to a town we'd never heard of. Relieved, we decided to follow it. The road narrowed as we continued, the trees growing denser until they seemed to form a tunnel around us. Then, the headlights flickered. "Did you see that?" Claire whispered. Before I could answer, the car stalled. The engine sputtered and died, leaving us in suffocating darkness. I turned the key again, but the car refused to start. Mike groaned from the back seat. "Great. What now?" "We'll check it out," I said, though my voice was far from confident. Claire and I stepped out, the cold air biting at our skin. The fog was thicker now, swirling around our ankles. The forest beyond the road was unnaturally still. No wind, no chirping insects, nothing. As I opened the hood, Claire grabbed my arm. "Do you hear that?" It was faint at first, a distant humming sound like static on a television. It grew louder, more distinct, until it became clear. A voice, low and guttural, calling out from the woods. "Hello?" Claire called, her voice trembling. I grabbed her hand. "Don't." But then it happened. Shapes began to emerge from the fog. At first, they were faint, like shadows cast by an unseen light. But as they drew closer, I realized they weren't human. Their forms were twisted and wrong, elongated limbs, hollowed faces, and eyes that glowed faintly in the dark. Claire screamed, and we bolted back to the car. I pounded on the windows. "Mike, Tara, unlock the doors." But when we climbed back, the back seat was empty. Where are they?" Claire stammered. "They were just here," I yelled, panic rising. The shadows surrounded the car now, pressing against the windows. Their faces, if you could call them that, were just inches from the glass, staring in with an unnatural hunger. The car groaned as though the weight of their presence was too much for it to bear. Then, all at once, they vanished. I turned the key in desperation, and the car roared to life. Without thinking, I floored the gas, swerving around the fog and speeding down the road. Claire clutched my arm, tears streaming down her face. "Where's Mike? Where's Tara?" "I don't know," I shouted. The road stretched on, endless and dark. We drove for what felt like hours, the forest never thinning, the fog never lifting. When we finally stopped, the car was nearly out of gas, and there was no sign of any town. We never found Mike or Tara. The police dismissed our story, chalking it up to exhaustion and stress. But Claire and I know the truth. Whatever we saw that night, it wasn't human. And sometimes, when I'm driving at night, I swear I see shapes in the fog, watching, waiting. It started as a simple hike. My friends and I had planned a weekend trip into the woods, away from the city's noise and chaos. We found a quiet trail deep in the heart of the forest. No cell service, no signs of civilization for miles. The air was fresh, the trees towering around us like silent sentinels. The first few hours were peaceful. We snapped photos, laughed, and enjoyed the serene surroundings. But as the sun began to dip lower, casting long shadows, the atmosphere shifted. The forest felt older, darker. The chatter among us grew quieter, the smiles fading. The trail began to twist and turn, and the further we went, the less we recognized where we were. Every familiar marker, a fallen log, a stream we crossed earlier, had vanished. We were lost. Should we turn back? Jess asked, her voice uncertain. No, Ryan said confidently. Let's find a clearing and set up camp there. We can figure it out in the morning. The sun disappeared completely, plunging the forest into near-complete darkness. We lit a small campfire, its flickering light barely piercing the encroaching shadows. The sounds of the forest grew louder, whispers in the breeze, distant thuds of something moving through the underbrush. Every small noise made us jump. Stop messing around, I said, trying to keep my voice steady. But even I could hear how uneasy I sounded. We're not alone, Ryan admitted softly. He stood up, scanning the surrounding trees. There's something out there. We huddled closer to the fire, whispering in hushed tones. The cold seemed to seep into the very air, pressing down on us. The flickering flames cast strange, shifting shadows, and from time to time we could see shapes, dark, fleeting figures, just beyond the light's reach. Suddenly, a voice broke through the night, a soft, echoing hum. It wasn't words exactly, but a haunting melody, weaving through the trees like a ghostly lullaby. My breath hitched, and I glanced around, my heart pounding. Stop it, Ryan said, though his voice trembled as well. The melody grew louder, more insistent. It wasn't just in our ears now. It seemed to come from everywhere, the air vibrating with the unnatural tune. The shadows around the fire flickered wildly, shifting into grotesque forms, limbs too long, faces contorted in agony. I could hear, breathing too, soft, hollow, almost like whispers being exhaled into the night. We need to leave, Jess said in a panic. Now. We tried to pack our things, moving as quickly as possible, but the sounds became overwhelming. Footsteps echoed in the distance, circling around us. I couldn't tell if they were real or imagined, but every time I glanced up, the figures in the shadows seemed closer, lurking just beyond the firelight. Finally, in a desperate rush, we ran, carrying only what we could in our arms. The melody followed us, growing louder and more distorted the further we fled. The forest seemed to stretch forever, the path twisting back upon itself as if we were trapped in some nightmarish loop. As we broke through the edge of the woods, gasping for air, the sound stopped. The forest fell silent once again, save for our ragged breathing. We turned back, too scared to venture deeper, and found our way to the road. The next morning, we returned with daylight, searching for the camp we had set the night before. But the clearing was gone. The fire pit was empty, the tent poles bent and broken, buried under a thick layer of dead leaves. Whatever had been with us in the dark was gone, but none of us would ever forget the night the forest tried to take us. It was late when we turned off the main highway, the only road leading into the remote, forgotten town. My friends and I had come looking for adventure, seeking out a place rumored to be abandoned for decades. The town was once bustling, full of life, but over the years it had been swallowed by time and nature. The streets were eerily quiet as we parked the car. Shadows loomed over the broken buildings, wooden storefronts crumbling, windows boarded up, and vines crawling over the facades. It was as if the town had been left to rot, forgotten and alone. We stepped out, flashlights cutting through the darkness. Every step we took on the cracked pavement seemed to echo louder than it should. The silence was deafening. "Does anyone else feel off?" Sarah whispered, her voice trembling. "I don't like this," Mark said, glancing nervously at the shadows that seemed to move slightly in the corners of his flashlight beam. The air was cold, almost frigid, and it seemed to tighten around us. Walking down the main street, we saw the remnants of life, a half-rotted bicycle against a storefront, faded signs hanging askew, and doors that creaked open slightly despite being bolted shut. The further we went, the more the feeling of isolation sank in, the sense that we were being watched. Suddenly, a distant sound echoed from somewhere behind us, a low, inhuman hum that seemed to rise out of the darkness. We spun around, but nothing was there. The hum grew louder, more persistent, the closer we got to the center of town. At the center, there was a square surrounded by buildings still mostly intact. However, in the center of the square, a stone statue of a woman stood, tall and beautiful, with her hands raised as though frozen in mid-motion. But something about her was wrong. Her eyes weren't hollow or lifeless, but full, vibrant, as if watching us. That wasn't there before, I stammered, pointing my flashlight at the statue. "No way," Mark whispered, stepping back. The hum grew unbearable now, reverberating through the air until it was a deafening, primal roar. We couldn't move, couldn't breathe, as the entire town seemed to shift around us. And then, from the windows, we saw them. Faces, hundreds of them. The windows, those that weren't boarded up, were filled with eyes. Every building was alive, its windows reflecting hollow, grotesque faces peering out at us. A voice echoed from nowhere. "You shouldn't have come." Panic set in. We screamed, struggling to run, but the streets seemed endless, the buildings closing in, the faces following us relentlessly. No matter where we turned, they were there, watching, waiting. The town wasn't abandoned. It was alive, and we were its next victims. It was supposed to be a quick hike, a way to get away from the noise of the city for a few hours. My friends and I drove out to a remote trailhead, deep into a dense forest that few people ever visited. The trees were tall, their branches forming a canopy overhead, casting the forest floor into a perpetual twilight. We didn't realize just how isolated we'd be until we were miles from the nearest road. The hike started off peaceful enough. The forest was quiet, save for the soft crunch of leaves beneath our boots and the occasional bird call. But as the sun began to dip lower, a strange unease crept in. The air felt heavy, almost suffocating, and the shadows between the trees grew, deeper with every step. "Are we sure we're still on the trail?" Jessica asked, her voice tense. "I think so," I replied, though doubt flickered in my mind. The trail markers had become sporadic, hidden under thick brush. The path ahead appeared untouched, as if the forest had reclaimed it. The deeper we went, the quieter it became. No more birdsong, no rustling of animals, just silence. It was unnatural, almost suffocating. The wind stirred the trees, but there was no sound, just a faint whisper that seemed to float through the branches. A voice, hushed, distant, repeating the same three words. "Follow. Follow. Follow." "Did you hear that?" Sean asked, his voice shaking. I nodded slowly, gripping my flashlight tighter. The whisper didn't seem to come from any particular direction. It seemed to echo all around us, carried by the very trees themselves. Suddenly, the forest shifted. Shapes moved at the edge of the light from our flashlights, things that weren't quite human, their forms indistinct and shifting. It was as if the darkness itself was alive, slithering toward us. "Let's get out of here," Jessica cried, her voice cracking as we started running back the way we came. But the forest seemed to shift with us. Every direction we turned, the path was unfamiliar, a maze of trees and darkness where nothing was certain. The whispers grew louder, more urgent. "Stay together," I yelled, my breath coming in short gasps. The flashlight flickered, then went out entirely. Panic surged through us as we stumbled in darkness, following only the sound of each other's hurried footsteps. Suddenly, we stopped. Before us was a figure. A tall, shadowy figure, humanoid but not entirely human. Its limbs were elongated, distorted, and its face was a void, hollow and void of features. It stood motionless, silent, as if waiting. "Run!" Sean screamed, shoving Jessica into motion. We bolted, pushing through the trees as fast as we could. The creature followed, its presence stretching and distorting the very air around us. With every breath, we felt more disoriented, as though we were losing our way faster with each step. We didn't know if we were running toward safety or deeper into the trap. The whispers had become deafening, suffocating, an endless chant of "follow, follow," that threatened to consume us entirely. And then, without warning, we broke through a clearing, a familiar spot. The trail markers had been there all along, hidden beneath the underbrush. We collapsed onto the ground, gasping for breath, as the figure vanished into the shadows. The forest fell silent again, and it stayed. That way, we didn't speak, we didn't dare. It had been years since anyone had lived in the grand old estate. The once stately mansion sat at the edge of a wooded hill, its windows dark and its gates rusted shut. The locals spoke of it in hushed tones, whispers of the family who had vanished, without a trace decades ago. Curious, my friends and I decided to explore it. As we parked our car along the long winding driveway, the sun was setting fast. Shadows stretched across the lawn, and the silence was unsettling. No birds, no breeze. The air felt thick, almost suffocating. We approached the mansion cautiously, stepping over overgrown weeds and broken cobblestones. Inside, the house was a mausoleum of forgotten memories. Dust coated every surface and the scent of decay was overwhelming. Furniture had been pushed aside or torn apart, revealing splintered wood and faded fabrics. The grand chandelier above us hung precariously, its crystals cracked and reflecting warped shadows. "Be careful," I warned as we navigated the dark hallways, but the others were too mesmerized by the beauty of the place to heed my words. In the ballroom, the floorboards creaked beneath our feet, sounding louder than they should have. A broken mirror leaned against the far wall, reflecting an empty space where a figure shouldn't have been. Yet, when I glanced back, I swear I saw a distorted face, its eyes hollow and sunken, watching us from the reflection. I turned away quickly, dismissing it as a trick of the dim light. We continued deeper, searching for signs of anything left behind. At the far end of the hall, we stumbled upon a locked door, its wood old and warped with age. There was something unsettling about it, like the very air around it was heavier. As I touched the doorknob, a chill ran down my spine. Before I could turn it, a voice whispered from behind us. "You shouldn't be here." We froze, turning slowly. The hallway was empty, no footsteps, no breathing. Just the echo of the voice lingering in the oppressive silence. I reached for my flashlight, but it flickered weakly, only illuminating the darkness further. My friends exchanged uneasy glances, but no one spoke. The weight in the air pressed, heavier, a suffocating presence looming over us. "Let's get out," someone whispered. As we turned toward the main entrance, a sound echoed down the hallway. Slow, deliberate footsteps, as if something impossibly tall was walking toward us. My heart pounded. The whispers grew louder again, no longer a voice, but a chorus of whispers, filling the room with ancient, inhuman murmurs. We bolted for the door, but it was locked. Panic set in. The whispers rose into guttural chants, filling the space with something dark, something long forgotten. Finally, with one final scream, the door burst open, revealing nothing but empty moonlight. The estate stood behind us, silent once more. We ran to the car, not daring to look back. The mansion was gone by the time we glanced over our shoulders. It was a dreary autumn evening when I found myself driving down an isolated country road, the map app on my phone flickering with uncertainty. My friends and I were on a weekend getaway, heading to a supposed abandoned lake house for a bit of adventure. The place was off the grid, miles from any sign of civilization. The closer we got, the more the road twisted through dense, shadowy forests. The sky darkened rapidly, and the air grew cold, biting at our skin through the cracked windows of the old car. The only sound was the distant croaking of frogs echoing through the woods. Finally, we arrived. The lake house sat on the shore, shrouded in mist and overgrown with ivy. It was far more decrepit than we had anticipated. Wooden boards warped, windows shattered, and the entire structure leaning slightly to one side. The front porch sagged under the weight of years of neglect. We stepped inside cautiously. The floors creaked beneath our feet, the silence oppressive. Dust covered everything. Furniture, bookshelves, even the walls seemed to absorb sound. Outside, the lake lapped against the shore with a haunting rhythm. "We should have brought flashlights," Sarah whispered, her voice shaky. Her phone had no signal, and the dim glow of our dying car lights was the only source of illumination. The others were just as uneasy. We spread out, exploring the house. Upstairs, the air grew colder, and shadows seemed to flicker across the walls. Every sound echoed too loudly. A floorboard snapping beneath a footstep, the rustling of curtains in the faint breeze. In the master bedroom, we found an old photo album resting on a cracked nightstand. Its pages were brittle, revealing faded images of a family long gone. As we flipped through the images, an unsettling pattern emerged. Every photo had a figure in the background, always watching. Their faces blurred, but their eyes followed us no matter where we turned. "It's just an old house," Alex said, but his voice trembled. "Nothing to worry about." Yet, we couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. The whispers started, faintly at first, soft voices that whispered things too quiet to make out. Then, the sounds grew louder, distorted, and malicious. Footsteps padded just out of sight down the hallways, each step measured and deliberate. "We need to leave," Sarah insisted, panic in her eyes. As we gathered in the living room, the front door slammed shut behind us. It didn't creak, it didn't slow. It slammed violently, sending a jolt through our chests. The windows rattled in their frames, and the room seemed to shrink, suffocating. The whispering voices grew louder now, weaving together into a chorus. Words emerged, sentences. Without meaning, but with an overwhelming sense of menace, each word sent chills down our spines, like claws scraping against bone. "Get out!" they hissed in unison. Our flashlights flickered and died, plunging us into absolute darkness. The house seemed alive, shifting around us, walls closing in, tighter. We stumbled blindly toward the door, only for it to remain locked. The windows were sealed with layers of fog, blocking any light or view of the outside world. Suddenly, from the darkness, a figure appeared in the room. A tall, shadowy silhouette with hollow eyes and a twisted grin. It moved slowly toward us, its footsteps dragging across the floor like nails on a chalkboard. "Leave us alone," I screamed, though my voice shook violently. But the figure continued, unrelenting, reaching out with elongated fingers. In the final moments, we fell to the floor, shivering as the whispers turned into a deafening roar, an unbearable symphony of terror, and then everything fell silent. It was a summer evening when my friends and I set out on a spontaneous camping trip into the woods. We found an old, abandoned cabin deep in the forest, something we'd heard whispered about but never truly believed existed. The sun was setting. As we arrived, casting long, shadowy figures across the overgrown clearing where the cabin stood. The wooden structure was weathered. Its roof caved in on one side, ivy and moss clung to the sides, and the windows were broken, leaving empty, dark spaces that seemed to peer back at us. The air was thick with the scent of damp earth and pine needles. "I read somewhere this place used to be used by hunters," Jamie said, kicking a loose board near the doorframe. "It's falling apart," Ryan added, looking at the crumbling porch. "Are you sure this is safe?" But curiosity had already set in. We pushed open the door slowly, the rusty hinges groaning as they moved. Inside, the cabin was dark and musty, with furniture covered in sheets of cobwebs. A thin layer of dust blanketed everything, and the air felt colder the moment we crossed the threshold. "Let's set up in here," Alex suggested. "This is way more interesting than a plain campsite." We made ourselves comfortable by the fireplace, the only source of light coming from a few battery-powered lanterns. As the night grew deeper, the wind began to howl through the trees, sending eerie whispers against the broken walls. That's when the noises started. At first, it was subtle, a faint rustling, like something moving behind the thin wooden walls. We chalked it up to small creatures, but as the night dragged on, the sounds became more pronounced. Footsteps creaked above us, slow and deliberate, shifting across the attic space. Each step seemed to echo through the cabin, even though no one was there, I think. "Someone's up there," Jamie whispered, her voice trembling. "Shh," I said, pressing a finger to my lips, but my breath caught in my throat as the footsteps moved closer, louder now, as if they were approaching the door. Suddenly, the floorboards beneath us groaned like they were alive. We all froze, the sound of our own breathing deafening. Then there was a knock, soft at first, barely audible, but repeated, louder and faster with every beat. Knock, knock, knock. It was coming, from inside the cabin, but there was nothing, no one, to make the sound. Ryan reached for his flashlight, shaking. "There's something in here," he whispered. "We need to leave," Alex said, his voice firm but trembling. "Now." We gathered our things quickly, moving as quietly as possible. But just as we reached the door, it slammed shut with a deafening crash. The knocking continued, this time right behind us, somewhere inside the cabin. "Open it!" Jamie screamed, banging against the door, but no matter how hard we pushed or pulled, it wouldn't budge. The windows, too, were covered with an unnatural fog, making it impossible to see outside. The knocking grew faster, more frantic, and the floor beneath us began to shake as if someone, was moving beneath it. Panic took over. We clawed at the walls, desperate to escape, but it was useless. The cabin's darkness swallowed us whole, and the knocking became deafening, an unrelenting symphony of terror. And then, silence. When we woke up, the sun had risen. The cabin was empty once more, not a trace of what had happened the night before. The floor was untouched, and the door was still closed as if nothing had ever happened. But we knew the truth. Something had been with us that night, watching, waiting, and it had no intention of letting us leave again. It was a long-forgotten train yard, nestled between rolling hills and overgrown fields. The sun had long since set, and the darkness of the night pressed in around us like a heavy shroud. My friends and I stumbled upon the site by accident. An old, rusted railway with derailed cars, long left to decay. Some were overturned, some had windows shattered, and most were missing parts of their sides, exposing the crumbling interiors. We had heard rumors of the place being haunted, but curiosity had led us here despite the warnings. Just a bunch of kids' ghost stories, my friend Alex had said. Nothing to be scared of. But as we ventured further into the rail yard, the air grew colder and the stillness became oppressive. There were no sounds, no birds, no insects, just the distant hum of wind through empty metal. We wandered deeper into the maze of rusted train cars, each one more desolate than the last. It was inside the second car we found something unusual. The floor had been stripped away in places, revealing a pit that descended into blackness. A crude ladder of broken metal hung halfway into the void. We shone our flashlights down into the darkness, but the light barely reached the bottom. "Should we check it out?" Emily whispered, her voice trembling. "Or is this something we shouldn't touch?" "I'm not climbing down there," John said firmly. "We don't know what's down there." Despite his words, the curiosity was too strong. Alex grabbed a loose piece of metal from the train and lowered it into the pit. The sound echoed unnaturally far, deep into the abyss. It felt endless. We all took a step back from the edge, the pit seeming to stretch far beyond what we could fathom. But that wasn't the worst part. As we moved, we noticed something strange. Scratches etched into the metal walls of the train car. Deep gouges, as if something had been dragged along them. They led all the way to the pit. "Who did this?" Sarah asked softly, her breath visible in the cold air. We couldn't answer her. There was no graffiti, no indication of vandalism. The scratches were deliberate, made with something sharp, something unnatural. Suddenly, a faint sound echoed from deeper within the train cars, a low whispering, unintelligible at first. It was soft, almost inaudible, yet it was persistent. Each time we moved, the whispers grew louder, circling us like a living presence. "Let's get out of here," Alex said, his voice trembling. "This isn't right." We hurried toward the exit, but as we reached the final car, the exit behind us slammed shut. The metal groaned with the force, sealing us inside. "Who the hell did that?" I shouted, frantic. "It wasn't any of us." We pounded on the doors, but they wouldn't budge. The whispers now filled the air, loud enough to make our ears ache. The scratching sounds began again, this time more frenzied, louder, clawing at the metal walls. "No, no, no!" Emily screamed, falling to her knees. "Stop!" Suddenly, through the flickering glow of our flashlights, we saw them, the shadows. Not just ordinary shapes, but grotesque, shifting forms. They emerged from the darkness, contorting, their hollow eyes fixed on us. There was no face, no discernible features, only black voids where they should have been. We could barely breathe. My legs gave out as the shadows closed in, the whispers intensified into a deafening cacophony, overwhelming us completely. Each shadow seemed to stretch its fingers toward us, their dark essence pressing against our skin. Then, I felt it, a cold, bony hand wrapped around my ankle, dragging me toward the abyss. Screaming, I fought to get free, clawing at the metal floor, but the grip was unyielding. As my flashlight flickered and died, the last thing I saw was the endless darkness swallowing me whole. It was a quiet, remote campsite surrounded by dense forest and a shallow, still lake. The sun dipped below the horizon early, leaving the sky painted in shades of deep purple and orange. My friends and I had set up camp near the water, far from civilization, and we were eager to escape the noise of city life for a weekend of peace and nature. The first night was peaceful until the sounds began. At first, it was subtle, a faint splashing from the middle of the lake, like something brushing against the surface. We chalked it up to the wind or some wandering animal, but the noises persisted even after midnight. A soft, rhythmic sound, like a slow, steady heartbeat. We stayed near the fire, trying to ignore the unease creeping into our bones. The shadows of the trees flickered in the flickering flames, creating haunting shapes against the dark, still water. "Does anyone else hear that?" Sam asked, his voice hushed, his eyes fixed on the lake. We all listened. The splashing grew louder, a sound almost like breathing, long, slow inhales and exhales echoing across the still surface. "Maybe it's a fish," Emily suggested, though. None of us sounded convinced, but it wasn't just the lake that seemed off. The forest was silent, too silent. Even the usual rustling of leaves was replaced with stillness, a heavy, suffocating quiet. The air grew colder, biting at our skin. Then something unnatural emerged. A figure, standing at the edge of the water. It was faceless, obscured in shadow, its body a dark, shifting mass. Long, thin arms reached out toward the water as though trying to pull something beneath the surface. Its movements were slow, deliberate, human, yet wrong in every sense. We were frozen in place. I fumbled for my phone, my flashlight illuminating a momentary glimpse, but it only made the figure seem more surreal, a black void against the shimmering lake. "Run!" I choked out, but my voice was barely a whisper. The figure began moving, toward us. Fast. Too fast for something unnatural. We bolted, tripping over roots and scrambling through the forest. The splashing sounds followed, closer than before. Each footstep echoed behind us, the breathing growing louder with every stride. My breath came in short bursts, panic seizing my chest. After what felt like hours, we burst back into camp, collapsing near the fire. The sound of the lake seemed to recede, but we didn't dare look back. The shadows were deep, the stillness oppressive. We sat there, huddled, until dawn broke through the trees. The figure was gone, but the hollow lake remained, dark and silent, a place we never dared return to. The building had been empty for years, a relic of a bygone era. My friend Kate and I had rented the attic apartment for a month to escape the city, seeking peace and solitude. The place had a certain charm, wooden beams, old creaking floors, and tall windows that overlooked a quiet street. At first, everything seemed fine. The mornings were calm, with the sun filtering through dust-filled air. But as the days passed, strange occurrences began to surface. Small things at first, a door closing by itself, shadows flickering across the room when no one else was moving. We attributed them to the creaking old house settling, chalking it up to the creaky floorboards and drafty windows. One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, we heard a soft tapping, repeated, deliberate. Kate opened the door to check, but no one was there. The hallway was empty. "I swear," Kate whispered, "someone was knocking." "We're just being paranoid," I said, trying to calm her nerves. "It's an old place. Noise travels." But that night, the tapping returned, this time louder. It came from the attic door itself. The sound echoed through the small apartment, making the walls seem alive. I grabbed a flashlight and approached the door. "Hello?" I called out. Silence. No response. Kate had gone to bed, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was waiting on the other side. The following days only intensified the strange occurrences. At night, the temperature dropped unnaturally low. The old radiator whistled with a low, unsettling hum, while the sound of footsteps seemed to walk across the attic floor, light, hesitant, as if something was pacing back and forth. One afternoon, I decided to investigate further. Kate was out running errands and the apartment was silent. I climbed the narrow staircase to the attic, each step creaking under my weight. When I reached the top, the attic was in darkness. The air felt thick, almost suffocating. I flicked on my flashlight, revealing a dusty, sparsely furnished room. Furniture was draped in white sheets, and the only sound was my breathing. The walls were lined with old photos, hundreds of them. Faces stared back at me, some smiling, some hauntingly vacant. But what disturbed me most was that the eyes seemed to follow me as I moved around the room. The tapping started again, louder, from inside the room. I froze. "Kate?" I called out, but there was no response. I pressed forward, lifting one of the sheets covering a chair. Beneath it sat an old antique camera, its lens fixed towards the far wall. Dust coated the lens, but when I moved closer, the faint image of a face appeared, one I couldn't recognize. The tapping grew louder, erratic. The air grew colder, and I felt a pressure against my chest, an unseen weight, as though something was pushing down on me. I turned to leave, but as I opened the door, it slammed shut behind me. The room flickered in and out of sight, shadows dancing across the floor, and then I saw it, a figure, standing in the corner, its face hidden beneath. A tattered hood, I screamed, unable to move. The figure raised its hand, revealing dark, lifeless eyes beneath the hood. The tapping stopped. Suddenly, the attic door burst open and Kate rushed in. "What's happening?" she cried. The figure vanished into the shadows, and the attic was still once more. What was that?" I stammered, my voice shaking. "I don't know," Kate said, her eyes wide. "But we need to get out of here." We left the apartment, leaving the door wide open behind us. The strange presence never returned, but to this day, I can't forget the sound of that tapping, its rhythm echoing in my mind. It was supposed to be a weekend camping trip, just my friends and I in the middle of nowhere. No cell service, no crowds, just a quiet patch of forest surrounded by rolling hills. We'd packed enough supplies to last the weekend: tents, sleeping, bags, and plenty of food. But something felt off from the moment we arrived. The forest was dense with towering trees that blocked out most of the sunlight. The air was thick with the scent of pine and damp earth. As we set up camp, I couldn't shake the feeling that we weren't alone. Strange noises echoed through the trees, branches snapping, low whispers, and they came from nowhere and everywhere, at once. That night we gathered around the fire telling stories and laughing. But as the fire dimmed, the whispers grew louder. Each sound seemed to brush against the edge of my awareness. A voice in the dark, indistinct and unsettling. "Did you guys hear that?" I asked, shivering despite the heat from the fire. "Hear what?" Sophie replied, her voice uneasy. "Stop being paranoid." But the whispering didn't stop. It was almost as if something was moving through the trees, circling us. The wind howled faintly through the leaves, but it wasn't the wind alone. Shadows danced among the trees, shifting and twisting in ways they shouldn't have been able to. Inside the tent that night, sleep refused to come. Every rustle of leaves, every creak of the tent fabric was amplified 1,000-fold. I kept my flashlight close, shining it around the tent at regular intervals. The darkness outside seemed unnatural, too deep, too still. At some point I heard footsteps, soft, deliberate steps, moving around the camp. I sat up abruptly, my heart pounding. My friends were still asleep, unaware. I peeked through the tent's fabric, hoping to catch a glimpse, but there was nothing. Only darkness. The next morning, we packed up in haste. None of us mentioned what had happened during the night, but the tension was palpable. Something about the forest didn't feel right anymore. As we returned along the trail we'd hiked in on, I found my phone miraculously had signal again. I pulled it out to snap a photo of the scenery. When I reviewed the image later, I nearly dropped my phone in shock. In the background of the photo, just barely visible between the trees, was a face, pale, twisted, and watching us. We never camped there again. It had been years since anyone had dared venture near the old well at the edge of town. The stories surrounding it were whispered among the locals. Tales of strange sounds, vanished hikers, and eerie lights that flickered in the dead of night. Most people avoided the well, not out of fear, but out of respect for the ominous legends. But curiosity got the better of me. One late autumn evening, after hearing so many eerie tales, I decided to visit the well alone. my friends had all warned me not to go, but I couldn't resist. The town's ancient history called to me, and the thought of uncovering some forgotten mystery was too tempting. The path to the well was overgrown, hidden beneath layers of fallen leaves and twisted roots. Darkness cloaked the forest, the trees leaning in like they had stories to tell. It was cold, so cold that even my breath formed thick clouds in the air. The faint glimmer of the well came into view as I pushed my way through the underbrush. Ikibachi. Well itself was old, crumbling stone with a rusted metal bucket sitting awkwardly in its center. The air felt heavy, unnatural, a sense of dread wrapping around my chest. A dim, flickering lantern hung from the well's side, casting strange shadows that twisted unnaturally in the dark. I set my flashlight on the ground and leaned in close to inspect it. The hole was deep, much deeper than it should have been. The sound of dripping water echoed from the bottom, a slow, monotonous drip that made my skin crawl. That's when I heard it, a faint whisper. It wasn't coming from the well. It came from behind me, from deeper within the woods. It was a woman's voice, soft yet chilling, almost melodic. She was saying something, but the words were indistinct, like they were spoken in a language, lost to time. "Hello?" I called out, my voice barely a whisper. Silence. I turned back toward the well, gripping my flashlight tightly. The chill deepened and the shadows seemed to shift once again, moving closer, circling the well. There was something unsettling about the way they moved, not driven by wind or natural causes. The lantern flickered harder, its flame sputtering as if something unseen was feeding on it. I reached down to retrieve my flashlight, but as my hand brushed the cold metal, I saw it. Faces, hundreds of them, distorted and gray, pressed against the surface of the water at the bottom of the well. The faces were crying. Silent tears slid down their features, blending into the dark water. Their mouths were twisted in expressions of pain and longing, and their eyes, oh their eyes, hollow, empty, and searching. A sudden gust of wind howled through the trees, snapping the silence. The whispers grew louder, surrounding me now, voices overlapping and blending into a terrifying symphony of sorrow. I could hear them pleading, crying out, voices from the well, calling for something I couldn't understand. I backed away, my breath catching in my throat. "No," I whispered, though my voice trembled. I didn't realize how far I had retreated until my back hit the rough bark of a tree. The shadows closed in, their form no longer shapes, but human-like figures. Long, gaunt, with hollow faces and lifeless eyes. Their fingers reached out, elongated and grotesque, dragging across the surface of the well, clawing toward me. "Please," I begged, lifting the flashlight again. The beam cut through the darkness, pushing them back, but they came closer as if drawn to the light. "Leave!" I screamed, feeling my legs give out beneath me. The figures paused at the edge of the light. They stared at me, not with malice, but with despair. Then they began to fade into the shadows once more, their hollow eyes lingering in the darkness. When I looked back at the well, it was still, silent again, save for the slow drip of water. But the faces remained beneath the surface, watching, always watching. I stumbled back through the forest, my legs shaking, my breath uneven. The well was still behind me, a hollow abyss waiting, ready to consume anyone foolish enough to look inside. And I knew, some mysteries should never be uncovered. It was just another quiet town with a forgotten past. The old library had been sealed off for decades. Everyone knew the stories, the whispers about the bookshelves that seemed to move, the strange symbols found in ancient texts, and the chilling presence that kept people away. I had always been curious, but never brave enough. Until now. It was a challenge more than anything, a dare from my friends. They didn't believe the rumors, and neither did I, at first. But curiosity got the better of me. So, alone, I ventured. Inside, the air was thick with dust and the scent of old paper. The building felt ancient, the wood creaking beneath my every step. Dim sunlight filtered through the grime-covered windows, casting eerie shadows across the floor. Silence. Complete and absolute silence. The first floor was empty. Just rows upon rows of forgotten books, their spines cracked and curling, some toppled over as if abandoned mid-sentence. I wandered deeper into the library, past the reference section and into the archives where the real history was kept. That's where things began to feel strange. Each room I entered seemed smaller, more cramped. The shelves shifted slightly when I wasn't looking, just a few inches, but enough to disorient me. I turned around once and the doorway I had just passed was gone. No, not gone. Replaced. A different hallway, a different aisle. This is ridiculous, I muttered, my voice barely above a whisper, but it didn't feel like the library was listening. No, it felt like something else was. Then I heard it, the soft rustling of pages, distant yet near. A low hum of whispered words, indecipherable and unsettling. It wasn't coming from any book or recorded sound. It was in the air. Every room I entered felt more confined, more oppressive. The shelves seemed to close in, tighter and tighter, as if the library were alive. Each corner I rounded had shadows that seemed too deep, too long. Whispers became voices, murmuring, calling my name. My flashlight flickered, the batteries draining rapidly as though the darkness was feeding on the light. Suddenly, I stumbled into a circular room, the rare archives. Here, the bookshelves formed a dome around me, books pressed together as if holding something back. The symbols in the ancient texts were sharper, more vivid, glowing faintly against the faded pages. Some of them began to shift, writhing like they had a life of their own. The hum turned into a chorus of voices, louder now, more distinct. It was a language I couldn't understand, but the intent behind it was clear. Fear, rage, hunger. The walls around me pulsated, the very air vibrating. I could feel it. Something watching, something lurking just beyond the edges of my vision. The darkness pressed against my skin, heavier with every passing second. My breath quickened, but it was getting harder to breathe. I fell to my knees, hands covering my ears, but the voices only grew louder. My flashlight was useless now, dead, flickering in the darkness. I couldn't escape. I couldn't move. Then, a voice broke through the chaos. "Leave!" It wasn't in my head. It was real. A clear, commanding voice. The others grew silent, the whispers fading into nothingness. I looked up. Standing before me was a figure in a long, flowing robe, its face obscured, but its presence, radiating something ancient, something otherworldly. It pointed toward the doorway. "Leave. Now!" I scrambled to my feet, following its silent command. The library trembled with each step I took toward the exit. The aisles opened wider. The oppressive weight lifting as I pushed toward the entrance. Behind me, the voice echoed one last time. "You shouldn't have come." The library was gone when I finally stepped outside. Just an empty building, swallowed by the quiet streets of the town. Nothing remained. No trace of the ancient presence, only the memory of its whispers. I never spoke of it again. It had always been a dream of mine to visit the old lighthouse perched on the edge of the coast. Lonely and secluded, it stood tall against the crashing waves, weathered by time and the elements. No one had lived there for decades, and the stories surrounding it were enough to keep tourists away. Whispers of strange sounds, shadows moving in the corners of windows, and eerie lights flickering from the tower at night. I had heard those stories, but curiosity won out over fear. With nothing but my camera and a notebook, I set out alone to capture the lighthouse. The journey was long and treacherous, the winding coastal roads cutting through cliffs that seemed to scrape the sky. By the time I reached the lighthouse, the sun was sinking below the horizon, leaving the sky in a wash of muted colors. The building loomed over me, massive and imposing. Rusted metal stairs spiraled up the side, disappearing into the top of the tower. I knew there was no electricity, no phone signal, and no one for miles. The isolation was absolute. Still, I was eager to explore. Inside, the air was damp and cool. Old furniture, faded and broken, littered the main room. The walls were lined with photographs and journals, evidence that someone had once called this place home. Dust coated everything, settling like a veil over the long-forgotten memories. Flashlight beam cut through the darkness as I made my way to the staircase. Each step creaked underfoot, the sound echoing down the empty halls. Shadows stretched endlessly in every direction. The higher I climbed, the colder it became, the wind whipping through the open windows. The top of the lighthouse was a narrow room, filled with metal machinery and a glass lens that once guided ships safely through the night. The light had long since died, but the memory of it still hung in the air, a strange, almost tangible presence. I began taking photographs, capturing the decay, the emptiness. The silence was oppressive, the kind of silence that seems to hum just beyond the ears, a constant, subtle pressure against the senses. I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. "Hello?" I called out, my voice a whisper in the vast emptiness. There was no response, just the wind outside, battering the lighthouse like a living thing. But the sensation only grew stronger, as though something was watching me, just beyond the edge of sight. I glanced around, camera ready, but there was nothing. Still, I kept snapping photos. The lens flared once, casting an eerie glow in the dark. Looking through the viewfinder, I saw something, a pale face in the corner of the frame. It wasn't there in reality, only in the photograph. A ghastly figure, eyes hollow and mouth slack, peering out from the shadows. I froze, unable to move. Shaking, I snapped another shot, but the face wasn't there anymore. It was gone, as if it had never existed. I checked the photos in disbelief, but each one was empty, just the desolate interior of the lighthouse. My breath quickened. Suddenly, a voice echoed softly in the distance, carried on the wind. "Stay." I spun around. "Who's there?" Silence. But that voice, so close, so clear, lingered in my mind like a haunting melody. I looked out the windows, scanning the coastline. Nothing but waves crashing against the rocks and the infinite horizon. The hairs on my neck stood on end. I felt exposed, trapped by the vast emptiness. My flashlight flickered again, dying for a moment before flickering back to life. It seemed weaker now, the beam wavering as if struggling against something unseen. I stumbled down the stairs, desperate to escape the oppressive atmosphere. The lower levels were darker, more enclosed. The wind howled through the windows, but it wasn't enough to drown out the whispers that grew louder with each step. "Leave," the voice whispered again, closer this time. A breath in my ear, I raced toward the door, fumbling with the rusted handle. My flashlight shut off entirely, plunging the lighthouse into complete darkness. Panic surged through me. I heard footsteps, bare, ragged footsteps, on the wooden floor below. They echoed louder and louder, as though whatever was chasing me was right behind me. "Stay with me," the voice said again, this time more insistent, more menacing. With all my strength, I kicked the door open, stumbling into the night. The heaty sea breeze hit me like a wave, cold and bracing, pushing the whispers away. I ran toward the car, away from the lighthouse. As I sped down the coast, the images flashed through my mind. The face in the photograph, the voice, the footsteps, and I knew. I knew the lighthouse was alive, a place too long abandoned, too tied to something unnatural, something that had never truly left. To this day, I never returned. The lighthouse still stands there, solitary and quiet. But I can't. Forget the shadows that reside within it. Some places I've learned should never be explored. It started when my friends and I decided to take a detour on our road trip home. We stumbled upon an old abandoned amusement park tucked away deep in the woods. The entrance was rusted, the sign barely readable, but the promise of something. Eerie and unknown pulled us forward. "Let's check it out," Jake said, grinning. "This could be fun." We parked near what was once the park's main gate. It stood crooked, half swallowed by overgrown vines. There were no lights, no signs of life, just the looming silhouettes of rides frozen mid-motion. The air was thick, with the scent of damp earth and decay. We explored cautiously, but everything seemed harmless, at least on the surface. The Ferris wheel still stood, its cars swinging gently in the breeze. The roller coaster tracks curved into the distance, rusted but intact, but something felt off. As we walked deeper into the park, we heard strange whispers. It wasn't just the wind, it was like murmurs right behind us, faint and indistinct. We kept looking over our shoulders, but there was never anything there. "Maybe it's just the trees," Mia said, trying to sound confident, but her voice shook slightly. We laughed nervously, brushing it off. However, our carefree attitude quickly shifted when we stumbled upon the funhouse. Its entrance loomed in front of us, dark and menacing. The glass was cracked and the painted figures inside were grotesque, grinning faces contorted into expressions of pure malice. "Let's skip this one," I suggested, but Jake was already pushing the door open. "Come on, it's fine," he said, waving us forward. Inside, the funhouse was a nightmare. Mirrors lined the walls, distorting our reflections into nightmarish versions. Hollow eyes, twisted smiles. The floor beneath us creaked with every step, but no one else was around. The whispers became louder, sharper, like they were breathing, directly into our ears now. Suddenly, the door slammed shut behind us. We froze. The sound was deafening. "Okay, this isn't funny," Mia hissed. The mirrors began to shift, revealing glimpses of something behind us. Figures with distorted, shifting faces, eyes that glowed faintly in the glass. Their mouths moved, whispering words we couldn't understand. The reflections became more lifelike, more real. "We have to get out," Jake said urgently, rattling the door handle. It wouldn't budge. Panic surged through us. The whispers were deafening now, almost like a chorus, insistent, demanding. The figures in the mirrors stepped forward, more defined, more alive. One by one, they started to appear beside us. "Run!" I screamed, pushing through them. We bolted out of the funhouse, but they followed. The ground seemed to ripple beneath us, and the park itself felt alive, twisting, warping. Shadows stretched unnaturally long, crawling across the pavement like dark tendrils. We didn't know where we were going, just forward. The park had no exits. The walls, the rides, everything was alive, alive with those twisted, whispering figures. Mia tripped on a broken piece of track, her scream cutting through the night. Instinctively, I stopped, turning back. The figure in the mirror was closer. Now, almost merging with her, its twisted smile growing wider. "You shouldn't have come here," it whispered, its voice 1,000 voices at once. "No," I shouted, pulling her up, ignoring the phantom hands that seemed to grab at her from every shadow. Jake shouted something behind us, but I couldn't hear him over the cacophony. The whispers became screams, the figures dissolving into inky shadows. That seeped into the ground. Finally, we broke through the park's limits, rushing into the trees. The air outside felt clean, but we knew we couldn't return. The park was gone by the time we looked back. No one believed us, of course. The abandoned amusement park didn't show up on any map the next day. It had vanished as if it had never existed. And the whispers, they still haunt us in our dreams. We survived, but sometimes the only thing worse than not knowing is knowing we weren't truly alone. We moved into the house during the summer. It wasn't anything special, a modest home with chipped paint and a narrow, overgrown yard. Nothing unusual stood out at first, beyond the quiet that settled over the neighborhood. It was peaceful, a bit too peaceful. From the very first night, things felt wrong. The house settled into a silence that was unsettling. No creaks from the floorboards, no rustling of branches against the windows. It was as though the house itself held its breath. At first, we dismissed it. Old houses have their quirks, right? Maybe it was just the wind, or maybe we were just adjusting to the quiet after moving in. But the feeling never went away. The strange occurrences started subtly. Our daughter, Sophie, would wake up screaming in the middle of the night. She claimed that someone was standing at the foot of her bed. Always a shadowy figure, never fully there, just a presence. Every time we checked, nothing was there. Her nights became restless, and soon she wouldn't sleep at all without the bedroom door wide open. One evening, we heard a faint, hollow sound coming from the walls. It sounded like whispers, low and distorted, as though a dozen voices were trying to speak at once, but only half-formed. We thought perhaps it was the house settling further into its old age. The realtor said it hadn't been lived in for years before we bought it. But the whispers never faded. They came and went unpredictably, sometimes late at night, sometimes during the day when the house should have been still. Sometimes it sounded like faint laughter, soft, high-pitched, inhuman, and it sent chills down our spines. Then the visions began. I'd see it standing in the corner of rooms, a figure barely discernible in the shadows, always watching, always near but never moving. The more I focused on it, the blurrier it became, like the smoke swirling in the corners of my vision. It was like it didn't want to be fully seen, but it still wanted us to know it was there. One evening, my husband, James, went into the basement to grab a tool. He was down there for what felt like hours before I finally went down to check on him. When I found him, his face was pale, his body frozen. He stared at the far wall, his mouth trembling as though trying to speak, but no sound came out. "What's wrong?" I asked, shaking him gently. Finally, he managed to whisper, "The eyes. They're watching me." I didn't see what he saw, but I felt it, an oppressive, suffocating presence. The whispers had grown louder, and the figure was closer. After that, things escalated quickly. Sophie refused to enter her room alone, her little hands clutching at ours tightly, her tiny voice begging for us to stay with her. Objects would move on their own, the television turning on at odd hours, cupboards slamming shut when no one was near. But the worst part was the feeling. A cold, hollow breath on the back of our necks when we were alone in the house. One night, I woke up to a loud thud from downstairs. I was about to call out, thinking it was just James, but the silence that followed was unlike any sound I'd ever heard. It was as if the house itself had swallowed the noise. I hurried down to check, but no lights worked, no matter how many. Switches I flipped. The only sound was the whispers, insistent now, louder, more desperate, and then I saw it. The figure stood in the living room. Its features were clearer now, grotesque, almost human, but twisted. Skin stretched unnaturally, tight over its bones, empty sockets where the eyes should be, its mouth gaping in an expressionless scream. It didn't move, yet I could feel its presence press against every inch of the room. I didn't scream. I couldn't. I was paralyzed with fear, unable to tear my gaze away from the monstrosity in front of me. When James woke up and found me trembling, by the doorframe, he couldn't see it. Not at first. I couldn't explain what I had seen, not fully. But when he entered the room, the whispers rose again, louder, angry, demanding. The figure moved closer. That night, we gathered Sophie in the hallway, away from her room. We didn't dare sleep in the house anymore. We spent the rest of the night huddled in the car, not knowing what to do, too terrified to return inside. The next day, we left the house behind. We didn't touch anything. No clothes, no belongings. We simply left it all, retreating back to a rental with no windows into the past. The whispers still haunt us, sometimes when we're alone, sometimes in dreams. The figure isn't gone. It lingers, a dark stain we can't wash away. We've tried to move forward, but we know it's not over, not entirely. The house is quiet now, empty, forgotten by the world. But we know we're not the only ones who feel its pull. And we dread the day someone else steps into that house because we know the whispers will return, and so will the figure, waiting to make itself seen again. I work as an audio engineer for a small, independent podcast company. One night, my boss handed me a recording and asked me to clean up the sound for a special episode. Something unusual. It was an old tape, one of those analog cassettes that hadn't been used in years. The label was faded, but it read only 2 words. Listen carefully. Curious, I popped the tape into the machine. The first few seconds were filled with static. Then, a soft voice broke through, barely audible at first. "Hello?" It was a woman's voice, distant, trembling. I turned up the volume to hear better, but as I did, the voice grew clearer. "I need to tell you something. If you hear this, it's too late. It's already too late." I paused the recording, my fingers hovering over the controls. A feeling of unease settled in my stomach. It felt wrong, like I wasn't supposed to be listening. But I continued. The voice spoke again. More, urgently this time. "Don't trust the man with the glasses. Don't let him in." I couldn't stop listening. The fear in her voice was palpable, and every word sent a chill down my spine. The rest of the recording was a jumble of muffled sounds, breathing, footsteps, and a sharp metallic scraping noise, followed by a loud crash that made me jump. Then came a silence so thick it felt suffocating. "Please," the voice whispered. "They're coming for you. Don't—" The tape cut off abruptly. I rewound the tape and played it again, but this time there was nothing. No voice, no sounds, just dead silence. It didn't make sense. I checked the tape, the machine, everything, but the recording was gone. It was as if it had never been there. I sat in the dark studio, feeling the hairs on my neck stand up. Maybe it was a prank, an elaborate hoax. But why would my boss have it? Why ask me to clean it up? Something wasn't right. The next day at work, I didn't say anything. I kept the tape to myself, unsure of how to explain it. When my boss asked about the cleaning, I lied and said there was nothing to fix. He didn't press, but I noticed something odd. His glasses, thick and black, almost like the man from the recording. It was just a coincidence. I convinced myself of that. That night, after leaving work, I decided to head straight home. But as I walked down the street, I saw a man standing across the street staring at me. He was wearing glasses, thick, dark glasses that made his face look oddly distant, obscured. The same glasses as the man from the tape. I froze. My heart raced. Was it him? Had the woman been talking about him? I quickly turned down a side alley, walking faster. The footsteps behind me echoed, growing louder. The man was following me. I broke into a run, my breath coming out in panicked gasps. But every time I glanced over my shoulder, he was still there, keeping his distance but never breaking pace. Finally, I reached my building. I fumbled for my keys, hands shaking. I slammed the door shut and locked it behind me, gasping for air. But through the window, I could see him still standing across the street. His gaze was locked on me. He didn't move. Hours passed, and I stayed inside, trying to rationalize what had just happened. Maybe it was a coincidence. Maybe I was just being paranoid. But then, I noticed something else. There, on my kitchen counter, was the tape. The same faded cassette, the same label. My heart skipped a beat. I hadn't brought it home. I stared at It for what felt like an eternity before slowly walking toward it. My fingers trembled as I picked it up. I didn't want to play it. I didn't want to hear that voice again. But I had to know. I put it in the recorder. This time, the voice was clearer than ever, right from the start. You shouldn't have listened. I didn't even need to hear more. I could feel it, the weight of whatever was in the recording pressing in on me. The man with the glasses hadn't left. He was here, in the room with me. I turned around, heart pounding. The room was empty, but the silence felt wrong, too quiet, too suffocating. And then I heard the sound of footsteps. They were coming closer. We had never expected to find ourselves wandering through the abandoned subway tunnels beneath the city. The place had been sealed off for decades, a relic of some bygone era. Our group of friends, 3 of us, decided to explore the underground labyrinth as a kind of reckless adventure, seeking something far from the ordinary. The air down there was thick, musty, and oppressive. Cracked tiles stretched endlessly down the tunnel, illuminated only by our dim flashlight beams. Water dripped from the ceiling in rhythmic patterns, forming small puddles that shimmered under the faint light. The silence was deafening, broken only by the soft echoes of our footsteps. At first, it felt like any other exploration. Creepy, sure, but nothing we couldn't handle. We were careful not to stray too far from the surface access point, as rumors of dangerous creatures lurking down here had always kept the tunnels off limits. But something about this place felt wrong. As we ventured deeper, the sense of isolation grew more oppressive. The tunnels twisted and turned, leading us farther from the surface. Shadows lurked in the corners of the flashlight beams, shifting unnaturally whenever we turned to look. The silence became more than just quiet. It felt like something was watching, waiting. Around midday, we stumbled upon an old subway station, long since abandoned. The walls were covered in faded, peeling advertisements, and a train sat eerily, still on the tracks, its rusted metal reflecting our lights in dull, distorted shapes. The station was dead, except for the lingering echoes of our footsteps. That's when we heard it. The first sign that something wasn't right. A faint, hollow whisper that seemed to come from nowhere. It was like the sound of the wind, but it carried a strange, otherworldly quality. It whispered again, clearer this time, as if the voice was directly in our heads. "Leave," it said, its tone calm yet unsettling. We exchanged nervous glances but shrugged it off. We decided to push forward, convinced it was just our imagination. The feeling of being watched only intensified. Shadows seemed to shift unnaturally, appearing and disappearing in ways that couldn't be explained. The further we went, the more we felt like we were no longer alone. By the time we reached the next station, something changed. The air grew colder. The whispers returned, louder now. "Leave," they seemed to echo all around us, distorted, overlapping. It wasn't just one voice anymore. It was as if the tunnels themselves were speaking, a chorus of voices stretching from the shadows. We tried to press on, desperate to find our way back to the surface. But the tunnels twisted endlessly, leading us deeper and deeper. No matter how far we walked, the whispers followed us, growing more insistent. They weren't just words anymore. They were commands, demands. "Leave, leave, leave." At some point, we lost track of where we were. The flashlight beams barely cut through the blackness, and the shadows seemed alive, creeping closer every second. My friends were frantic now, panic taking hold. I could see it in their eyes. Fear had taken root. Then, from the darkness, we heard it. A sound that stopped us dead in our tracks. A low, raspy breath. Closer this time, right behind us. We spun around, but there was nothing there. Only darkness. And the whispers, louder now, filling our heads. "Leave, leave, leave." I wanted to scream, to run, but my legs wouldn't move. My friends stood frozen beside me, their faces pale and wide with terror. Whatever was down there wasn't just some wandering spirit. It was something far worse, something that had been waiting for us, buried deep beneath the city. And then, just as suddenly as it had started, the whispers stopped. The silence was deafening again, oppressive and suffocating. The darkness around us seemed thicker now, almost like it was alive, pressing down. "Run!" a voice suddenly roared in my head. We didn't hesitate. We bolted down the tunnels, sprinting back toward the surface, heartbeats pounding in our ears. The whispers started again, echoing behind us. But we didn't stop. We couldn't stop. When we finally emerged, gasping for air, we didn't look back. The city stretched out before us, and we didn't stop running until we were safe in the daylight. That day, we escaped. But whatever was down there, the thing that watched, that whispered, that chased us, we'll never forget. And neither will the darkness. I moved into my new apartment on Baker Street 3 months ago. The place was old, creaky, and cheap, perfect for someone like me who couldn't afford much else. The building was one of those worn-down, nondescript places that seemed forgotten. By time, the door always felt a little heavier when I pushed it open, like it didn't want to be disturbed. At first, everything seemed normal. The floors groaned beneath my steps, and I heard the occasional banging from the neighbors' apartments. But that was nothing unusual for a place this old. I never expected anything strange to happen in an apartment complex like this. Then, the whispers started. It was subtle at first, just a faint murmuring that seemed to drift through the walls at night. I'd wake up, the room dark and silent, only to hear a faint, indistinct voice whispering just beyond the edge of my hearing. The sounds were too quiet to make out, but they sent a chill up my spine. I chalked it up to my imagination, blaming the drafts and old pipes that groaned in the night. But the whispers grew louder, more persistent, and they didn't stay confined to the night. Sometimes during the day, I'd be in the kitchen making coffee, and I'd hear the faint echo of a voice behind me, a voice that didn't belong to anyone I knew. It wasn't speaking words, just sounds. A low, continuous murmur, like someone was speaking in a language that didn't exist. I tried to ignore it, but it wasn't just the whispers anymore. One evening, I was flipping through old photos of the previous tenants, trying to learn a bit about the place. They all looked like they had lived quiet lives, no signs of anything unusual. Yet, as I went through the last photo album, I noticed something strange. In each picture, there was a figure at the edge of the frame, always just out of focus, obscured by shadows or fog. A figure with hollow eyes and a twisted, impossible grin. At first, I thought it was just my imagination playing tricks. But the more I looked, the more it felt like that figure was watching me, waiting. One night, as I was lying in bed, unable to sleep because of the incessant whispers, I heard a different noise, a soft tapping at the window. I live on the 3rd floor, far above ground with no neighboring buildings close enough to peer into my apartment. But the tapping continued, slow and deliberate, like someone was gently scratching at the glass with long, bony fingers. I got up and approached the window. The city lights cast an eerie glow, but I saw nothing outside. No one was there, no reflection, just the endless void of night. The whispers grew louder then, filling the room, becoming unbearable. It felt like they were coming from inside my own skull. Desperate for answers, I started searching through the building's history, trying to find anything about the past residents. But there was no information available. No previous tenants, no official records, just the name of the building on a crumbling sign in the hallway. One evening, I was brushing my teeth when I noticed something strange. My reflection wasn't mine. It wasn't the reflection of a living person. It was that figure, the one from the photos, the twisted grin, the hollow eyes. It stared back at me with a sick, mocking expression, its mouth moving as if it were speaking without sound. That was when I understood. The whispers, the figure, the strange tapping. It wasn't a haunting of the past. It was something that had attached itself to me. I've tried to leave. I packed my bags and fled the apartment, but the whispers followed me. I can hear them now, louder than ever, as if they're inside my very being. No matter where I go, I can't escape their presence. The figure I know now isn't just a reflection. It's always watching, always waiting, and I fear I'll never be free of it. It was supposed to be a casual evening hike. My cousin and I had done this trail dozens of times before. It snaked through the hills above the town, offering stunning views of the sunset and just enough challenge to make you feel accomplished. That evening, we set out later than usual, hoping to catch the stars once the sun dipped below the horizon. We didn't think twice when we passed the old sign at the trailhead. It was rusted and illegible, but we knew the path by heart. The air was cool and still, and the only sounds were our boots crunching on the dirt and the distant chirping of crickets. As the sun set, the trees cast long shadows over the trail, making everything feel a little smaller, a little closer. About halfway up the hill, we stopped to catch our breath and take in the view. The sun was a fiery orange, sinking slowly into the horizon. But as the last rays of light faded, we noticed something strange. There was no moon, not even a sliver. The sky was darker than we had ever seen it, like a heavy curtain had been pulled across the stars. The first uneasy feeling crept in then, but neither of us said anything. We turned on our flashlights and kept walking. That's when we heard it, a soft rustling sound coming from the bushes ahead. It wasn't loud, but it was enough to make us stop. We scanned the area with our flashlights. The beam landed on nothing but branches and leaves. My cousin shrugged it off, muttering something about deer, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. The rustling continued, faint and deliberate, always staying just ahead of us on the trail. We kept walking, faster now, the rhythm of our footsteps breaking the silence. The trail felt different somehow, narrower. The trees seemed taller, their twisted branches reaching toward the sky like bony fingers. I tried to tell myself it was just the darkness playing tricks on me, but the feeling of being watched was impossible to ignore. The rustling stopped. We froze, listening. The night had gone completely silent. Not even the crickets were chirping anymore. My flashlight flickered and my stomach dropped. I smacked it against my palm and the light steadied, but that moment of darkness was enough to make my heart race. Then we heard it, a voice, low and breathy, coming from the trees. Help. It was faint, almost like a whisper carried on the wind. My cousin and I looked at each other, eyes wide. The voice came again, louder this time. It sounded close, too close. Help me. It didn't sound right. The tone was off, hollow, and strained, like someone trying to mimic a human voice but not quite getting it right. Against my better judgment, I called out, asking if someone was there. No response. Then we saw it. A figure stepped onto the trail ahead of us. It was shrouded in shadow, its shape impossible to define. My cousin aimed his flashlight at it, and I felt my blood run cold. The figure didn't have a face. It was smooth and featureless like a mannequin, but it moved like a living thing, jerking slightly as if adjusting to the light. We stood frozen, too scared to run, too scared to move. The figure raised a hand, pointing down the trail. Its arm was too long, the joints bending at unnatural angles. It tilted its head, and for a moment I thought I heard it breathe. Then it turned and walked into the woods, disappearing into the trees without a sound. The moment it was gone, the forest came alive again. The crickets chirped, the wind rustled the leaves, and it was as if nothing had happened. Without a word, my cousin and I turned and bolted back down the trail, running as fast as our legs could carry us. The trail felt endless, the trees closing in on us from all sides. When we finally reached the car, we slammed the doors shut and peeled out of the parking lot, not stopping until we were back in town. We never spoke about it after that night. I don't know what we saw, and I don't want to know. But sometimes when I'm lying awake at night, I can still hear that voice. It wasn't asking for help. It was calling us in. It had been months since I'd accepted the invitation to stay at my friend Alex's family estate. Nestled high above a craggy coastline, the mansion loomed like a relic from another era, its weathered stone walls crumbling with age. The estate had belonged to Alex's family for generations, a place shrouded in old tales and secrets that no one dared speak of. Upon arriving, the house seemed both grand and desolate, perched atop jagged cliffs that stretched out over the endless expanse of the sea. The only sound was the rhythmic crash of waves far below, echoing through the hollow chambers of the estate. There were no nearby neighbors, no cell service, and no signs of life beyond the three of us. It felt like we had stepped into another time. The first night, we wandered through the vast halls, exploring the ancient rooms. Everything inside felt untouched by the modern world. Dusty chandeliers hung from high ceilings, faded tapestries adorned the walls, and creaking floorboards seemed to groan beneath our every step. Every corner of the mansion seemed to whisper secrets from a forgotten past. That night, we gathered by the fireplace in the grand lounge. Shadows danced on the walls, the faint scent of something musty lingering in the air. Alex, with his usual bravado, told us the stories he had heard as a child about this house, tales of the mysterious disappearances of servants, strange voices echoing from the empty rooms, and doors that would close on their own in the dead of night. We had laughed it off at the time, brushing them aside as old family folklore. But things began to feel off. Late that night, after we had retired to our respective rooms, I lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, unable to shake a growing sense of unease. Outside, the wind howled through the cracks in the old mansion's stone walls. Suddenly, I thought I heard footsteps, faint, distant, echoing in the hallway outside. Probably just the wind, I muttered to myself, forcing my eyes shut, trying to dismiss the sound. But the footsteps persisted, soft and deliberate, growing louder with each passing moment. I listened, paralyzed with fear, as they moved closer, toward my door. The handle turned slowly, creaking as if something or someone was trying to open it. My heart pounded in my chest. I didn't move, barely dared to breathe. The door didn't open, but the footsteps didn't stop. They were right there, just beyond the threshold, before they faded into silence once more. Shaken, I stayed awake, the rest of the night clutching my blankets. The next morning, I found Alex and Emma in the dining room. Both were pale and clearly disturbed. "Did either of you hear that last night?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. "We did," Alex replied, his hands trembling slightly as he sipped from a cup of cold coffee. "But I don't know what it was." "We weren't alone," Emma added, her voice faint. "I couldn't sleep. I kept hearing something." The day passed in a haze of unease. We stayed close, never venturing far from each other, avoiding the isolated hallways and shadowed corners of the mansion. Every creak of the old wood, every gust of wind that rattled the windows sent chills down our spines. The sense of being watched was unbearable. By nightfall, exhaustion had overtaken us, but the oppressive atmosphere remained. As we gathered, once again in the lounge, we could feel it pressing against us, the feeling that something was waiting, watching. That night, something changed. At around midnight, we heard it again, the soft sound of footsteps echoing down the hall. But this time, they were different. They weren't distant, faint, or disembodied. They were right outside the door. Emma clutched my arm, her breath ragged. The doorknob twisted slowly, the metal groaning as if it were being forced open. We froze in place. Whatever was on the other side was here now, closer than we had ever imagined. The door creaked open and a figure stepped into the room. It was human-shaped, but not quite human. Its eyes, hollow and empty, glowed faintly in the darkness. Its movements were slow, deliberate, as if it wasn't bound by the same rules as us. It didn't speak. It didn't need to. In that moment, I realized what had been haunting us. The house wasn't just old and abandoned. It was something else, entirely. The footsteps, the whispers, the oppressive sense of presence, they had all been signs of something far more sinister than we could have imagined. We didn't run. We couldn't. Our legs refused to move. The figure remained at the door, watching us with its hollow, soulless gaze. And then, as suddenly as it had appeared, it was gone. The door shut with a soft, ominous click, leaving us trembling in the dark. We didn't sleep that night. We couldn't. When morning came, the mansion was quiet. No signs of the figure remained, but we knew, whatever it was still there, watching, waiting. And we knew we would never be truly alone in that house on the cliff. I didn't believe in ghosts or anything beyond what my eyes could see. Not until that night. It was just a normal evening when my friends and I decided to go hiking. We had heard about a hidden trail deep in the nearby forest, far from any roads, or signs of civilization. The air was crisp, the trees towered above us, their shadows stretching long and eerie as we followed the winding path. It was supposed to be a quiet escape, a peaceful night beneath the stars. The trail was narrow, barely more than a dirt path with thick forest on either side. The sunlight dimmed fast, leaving only the soft glow from our flashlights to guide us. We didn't talk much, just walking, listening to the crunch of leaves underfoot and the occasional rustle in the bushes. It was when we reached a clearing that things started to feel wrong. The atmosphere shifted. The forest was no longer the familiar, welcoming place it once was. The trees seemed taller, their branches forming a canopy that seemed to trap the light, casting deep shadows. The air grew colder, like the forest itself was holding its breath. We decided to set up camp there, thinking it was a good place to rest. But the longer we stayed, the more uneasy I became. The silence was deafening, as though the forest was holding its breath. I glanced around, trying to shake the feeling of being watched, but the woods felt alive in a way I couldn't explain. That's when I heard it. A faint, distant whisper. A voice, barely audible, carried on the wind. I stopped, my breath catching in my throat. "Did you hear that?" I asked my friends, but they shook their heads, too preoccupied with setting up the tents. I tried to brush it off, telling myself it was just my imagination. But as night fell, the whispers grew louder, weaving through the trees like they were calling to me. I could feel the weight of the forest pressing down on me, the darkness growing thicker. Then, in the stillness, I saw it. A figure standing at the edge of the clearing. A shadow, taller than any tree, motionless. I couldn't make out its features, just a black silhouette, watching us. My heart pounded, and I called out to my friends, but they didn't see it. I took a step toward the figure, compelled, despite the fear gripping me. As I drew closer, I noticed something strange. The figure didn't cast a shadow. The very ground beneath it seemed to bend around the shape, as though the light avoided it. It wasn't human. It was more like a void, a gap in reality. My legs felt weak, but I couldn't look away. I was frozen, watching as the figure tilted, its head almost as if acknowledging my presence. Then the whispers became a voice, calm but cold. "You shouldn't be here." I opened my mouth to speak, but no sound came out. The figure took a slow step forward, and I took a step back, realizing there was no escape. The whispers turned to screams in my head, but still, I couldn't move. Then, just as suddenly as it appeared, the figure vanished. The forest returned to its usual silence, but something had shifted. The unease lingered, heavier now, almost suffocating. My friends, oblivious to what had just happened, continued setting up camp, blissfully unaware. I never told them about the figure, about the whispers that still echo in my mind, and I never went back to those woods. To this day, I wonder if whatever I saw is still waiting. We lived in an old apartment building downtown. It was one of those places where everything creaked and the paint was peeling off the walls. The building had been around for decades, and rumors about its history had circulated among the tenants. Some said it had once been a hospital, others claimed it had been a prison. Whatever the truth, something about the place felt off. The first night we moved in, the floorboards groaned beneath our feet as we unpacked. My roommate, Alex, mentioned how quiet it was, too quiet. I had dismissed his worries, but as I lay in bed that night, I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. It started subtly, whispers in the darkness, barely audible. At first, I thought it was my imagination, something triggered by the creaking of the old building. But the voices grew louder, persistent. They seemed to be coming from inside the walls. I would sit up, my heart pounding, straining to hear. There was no pattern, no recognizable words, just a low, menacing murmur that seemed to echo endlessly. One evening, as I was cooking in the tiny kitchen, I caught something out of the corner of my eye, a shadow, just a flicker, darting between the fridge and the countertop. I froze, my breath catching in my throat. But when I turned, there was nothing there. I didn't know if I wanted to be relieved or terrified. Then came the night when it became impossible to ignore. The whispering wasn't confined to my room anymore. It followed me everywhere. The living room, the hallway, the bathroom. It was relentless, as though the building itself had become alive. I couldn't sleep, couldn't think. The murmur grew louder, closer, and I realized it wasn't something I could escape. One day, while unpacking a box of old books, I found a dusty, tattered journal tucked away. Its pages were crumbling, but I could still make out some of the faded handwriting. It described something, a spirit, a presence, that had been tormenting the building's residents for decades. The entries spoke of footsteps in the night, voices that couldn't be explained, and a feeling of being watched, always watched. That night, after reading the journal, the whispering changed. It wasn't just random murmurs anymore. It seemed to be directing its attention toward me. Words began forming in the static, faint at first, then louder. "You can't leave." I couldn't take it anymore. Desperate, I called Alex, who had gone out earlier that evening. When he arrived, his face was pale. He had been hearing the same whispers, the same voices. "I can't take this anymore," he confessed. "It's like they're inside my head." That's when we knew we weren't alone. Whatever haunted that building had found us. We packed up the essentials and left. In the weeks since, I've tried to forget, to convince myself it was all in my head. But the whispers still come. In the quietest moments, when I'm alone, I hear them again, faint but unmistakable. "You can't leave," and sometimes I wonder if it's already too late. It was supposed to be just an ordinary evening trip, something to break the monotony of everyday life. My friends and I decided to take the old winding road through the countryside, a place none of us had visited before. The idea was simple: leave behind the city's noise and escape into the quiet, untouched beauty of nature. The drive was uneventful at first. The road stretched ahead, snaking between tall, overgrown fields that swayed gently in the evening breeze. The sky was painted in hues of orange and pink, and we were lost in conversation, laughing about everything and nothing. The GPS kept pointing us forward, leading us deeper into the unknown. But then the air changed. The atmosphere became thicker, heavier. The trees began to crowd the road, their branches meeting high above like twisted fingers. It felt like we were descending into a different world, one untouched by time. We came to a bend in the road, and that's when it happened. The car jolted, the engine sputtering as it suddenly lost power. I steered to the side, the tires crunching against the gravel. The road was empty, and there was nothing for miles except endless forest. We tried to restart the car, but it was no use. The engine made a low, guttural sound and then gave up entirely. The silence that followed was suffocating, broken only by the distant rustling of leaves in the wind. "We'll walk to the nearest town," someone suggested, but none of us were sure where that even was. We decided to stay put, hoping someone would pass by and offer help. Our phones were useless, no signal, no bars. It grew darker, and soon the only light came from the dying glow of the car's headlights. We sat in silence, passing around a flashlight to keep the shadows at bay. The woods felt alive. Every creak and crack of the branches was magnified, as if something were watching us. I don't know how much time had passed when we heard it, the sound of footsteps, not from the direction of the forest, but behind us. We froze, holding our breath. The footsteps were slow, measured, like they didn't belong to anyone we knew. "Hello?" I called out, my voice trembling. No answer, just the soft crunch of shoes on gravel. The sound got closer, and then, to my horror, we saw them. A group of figures walking toward us from the darkness. They didn't run, didn't seem scared or worried. They moved like shadows, their faces obscured by the night, their footsteps steady and unwavering. "Who are you?" someone whispered, but the figures didn't respond. They just kept coming. The flashlight's beam swept over them, revealing details that chilled us to the bone. They were wearing mismatched, tattered clothes, faces void of expression. Their eyes weren't hollow. There was nothing behind them at all. They weren't human, not anymore. Panic surged through us as they stopped, standing in a silent circle around the car. They didn't speak, didn't react to our screams. They just stared, as though they were waiting for something. We knew we couldn't run. There was no point in screaming. We could only sit and hope they would leave, but the longer they stood there, the more I realized they weren't going anywhere. Then, one of them, barely more than a shadow, stepped forward. It wasn't one of the figures we had seen before. This one was different. It was taller, thinner, its limbs stretched unnaturally. It moved with a jerky, unsettling gait, like it didn't quite fit in its own body. It stared at us with cold, black eyes, and for a moment, I swear, it smiled. Not a human smile, but something inhuman, sharp, toothless, and utterly devoid of life. Time seemed to stretch as we sat there, trapped in the gaze of those empty eyes. The air grew colder, heavier. I couldn't take it anymore. I turned my head, away, unable to bear the sight. When I looked back, they were gone. The figures, the strange figure, they were all gone. The forest was silent again, the only sound being the rustle of leaves carried by the wind. We didn't stay. We didn't look back. We ran, screaming into the night, not stopping until we reached the edge of town and found help. I don't know what they were or where they came from. I don't think I ever want to know. All I know is that some things should remain hidden, buried deep in the shadows of forgotten places. It was the middle of summer, and my friends and I decided to take a day trip to a remote beach, far from the usual tourist spots. We wanted to escape the crowds and find some quiet, peaceful place to relax. The beach wasn't well known, tucked away down a narrow, winding road, hidden from the rest of the world. We arrived in the early afternoon, greeted by nothing but the endless stretch of sand and the gentle lapping of waves. The sky was clear, the sun blazing overhead. The beach, stretched out before us, empty except for a few distant figures far off in the distance. It was perfect. We set up our towels, spread out some chairs, and spent the day swimming, talking, and soaking up the sun. The water was warm, the air salty and fresh. It felt like paradise, away from the noise and rush of everyday life. But as the sun began to dip closer to the horizon, something started to feel off. The air seemed to grow heavier, and a strange quiet had settled over the beach. Even the waves seemed quieter, like they were retreating, leaving behind an eerie stillness. My friends didn't seem to notice, too lost in their own conversations, but I felt a prickling on the back of my neck, an instinctive warning that something wasn't right. I wandered a little closer to the water, scanning the horizon. That's when I saw them. Two figures standing at the edge of the ocean, staring out at nothing. They weren't moving, weren't even talking, just standing there as if they were waiting for something. I didn't want to believe it, but as I moved closer, I could see their faces. They weren't like us. Their eyes were hollow, dark, and empty. There was something wrong with their skin, too. Pale, almost translucent, as though they didn't belong in the sunlight. They turned slightly, as if sensing my gaze, but didn't. Look at me. Their attention remained fixed on the horizon. I felt a wave of panic rising, my breath quickening. I turned and ran back to my friends, my heart thudding in my chest. "We need to leave," I said, my voice trembling. "Now!" They laughed it off, thinking I was overreacting. But I couldn't shake the feeling of those figures standing there, their eyes lifeless, their faces twisted in a way I couldn't understand. As we packed up our things and started heading back, the silence followed us. The beach was still empty, the distant figures still watching us, their presence growing more and more oppressive. I glanced back one last time, and that's when I noticed something terrifying. The figures weren't there anymore, but I could still feel their gaze on me. I've always been a night owl. I'd spend hours driving back roads, listening to music, or just getting lost in thought. One night, I decided to take a different route home, one that looped through fields and quiet country roads. It was the kind of night where the stars felt closer, the sky so vast and clear it seemed to stretch forever. Around 2 a.m., I found myself on a lonely stretch of road, surrounded by nothing but farmland. The fields stretched out on either side of me, empty and dark, with only the occasional flicker of distant farmhouses. I remember thinking how peaceful it all felt, isolated but serene. That's when I saw it. A figure standing by the side of the road. At first, I thought it was a scarecrow. The silhouette was tall and thin, almost too thin, with its arms outstretched like it was waving. I slowed down as I approached, my headlights illuminating it. But it wasn't a scarecrow. It had a face, long, gaunt, and pale, like something that had been buried for years. Its hollow eyes didn't blink, didn't seem to recognize me. It stood there, motionless, as if waiting for something. I was frozen, unable to move. The figure didn't shift, didn't run. It just stood there, watching me. I held my breath, waiting for something, anything, but nothing happened. My car idled, the engine humming softly. Then, just as I was about to drive away, it moved. Not toward me, but away. It turned slowly and walked into the fields, disappearing into the darkness. I sat there, gripping the steering wheel, my mind racing. What had I seen? A hallucination? A prank? I drove home that night, my hands trembling on the wheel, but I couldn't forget the image, the figure. It wasn't just fear, it was something deeper, something that felt rooted in the very land itself. Even now, years later, I wonder if it's still out there, lurking in the fields, waiting for someone to cross its path again. The night it happened, I was driving home from a late shift. I always took the same winding route through the countryside, cutting through deserted backroads that few ever traveled after dark. There's something unsettling about these roads. No streetlights, no signs of life, just miles of empty fields and trees on either side. It's the kind of place that always feels like it's hiding something. That night, the air was unusually cold, even for late October. The moon was almost full, casting a dim, eerie glow over everything. The silence was overwhelming. No cars, no distant sounds of animals, just the low hum of the tires on the cracked asphalt. I wasn't in a hurry to get home, so I kept my speed steady, the familiar stretch of road ahead seemingly endless. That's when I noticed something strange. In the distance, I saw a figure standing on the side of the road. At first, I assumed it was someone waiting for a ride, but there was something off about it. How still it was. How unnatural. I slowed down as I approached. The figure didn't move, didn't flinch. It was just standing there, its back to me. I could barely make out its shape in the dim light, but I could see enough to tell it wasn't human. Its form was too tall, too thin, like it didn't belong in this world. My heart began to race as I drove past, gripping the steering wheel tighter. I glanced in my rearview mirror, expecting to see the figure still there. But it wasn't. I told myself I had imagined it, that the shadows had played tricks on my eyes. But then I saw it again, this time, closer. The same figure was standing at the edge of a field, facing me directly. Its silhouette was more distinct now, and I could make out its long, slender arms hanging limp at its sides. I wanted to turn around, to speed back the way I came, but something kept me driving forward. My hands trembled as I gripped the wheel tighter, my breathing shallow. The figure stayed motionless, not moving even as I passed. It wasn't until I reached a stretch of road where the trees thinned out that I realized the figure had somehow crossed the road ahead of me. It was standing there, halfway between where I'd last seen it and my location. Panic surged through me. I had no idea what this thing was or how it kept appearing. I slammed my foot on the accelerator, speeding past it without looking back. But every nerve in my body screamed for me to stop. When I finally reached the outskirts of the town, the figure was gone. I drove the rest of the way home, trying to make sense of what I had seen. The figure had felt wrong. Too wrong. That night, I couldn't sleep. I kept replaying what I had seen, convinced that whatever it wasn't something human. I couldn't shake the feeling that it was still out there, waiting. And I knew. I knew it wasn't done with me. It was supposed to be a relaxing trip. A few friends and I decided to escape the city and spend a weekend camping at a secluded lake in the mountains. None of us had been there before, but we'd heard it was quiet, beautiful, and perfect for getting away from the noise of the world. We arrived late in the afternoon, the sun sinking low behind the trees as we parked our cars by the edge of the lake. The water was calm, its surface reflecting the pale light of dusk like a mirror. The air was crisp, carrying the scent of pine and damp earth. For a moment, everything felt perfect. We set up our tents, gathered wood for a fire, and cooked dinner. The laughter and conversation filled the space, muffled by the stillness of the woods. It was everything we had hoped for. Peaceful, remote, and disconnected from the chaos of daily life. As night fell, we gathered around the fire, watching the flames flicker and listening to the quiet crackling. The stars appeared, one by one, stretching out into the endless dark sky. The lake reflected them, making it seem as though we were surrounded by an ocean of light. But it wasn't the beauty that started to unsettle me. It was the silence. No wind rustled the trees. No insects chirped, just the crackling fire and the faint sound of water lapping at the shore. It was too quiet, unnatural. I glanced around at my friends who were deep in conversation, unaware of the strange stillness. "I'm going to get some water," one of them finally said, breaking the silence. "Sure," I replied, trying to sound nonchalant. "I'll come with." We made our way to the edge of the lake, our footsteps silent on the soft earth. The water was cold and still, reflecting the dark shapes of the trees. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching us, waiting. "Hey," I whispered to my friend. "Do you feel that?" He stopped, looking at me, his face pale under the starlight. "Yeah, something's not right." We stood there for a moment, our eyes scanning the darkness beyond the trees. There was no movement, no sound, just the stillness. Then, from the corner of my eye, I saw it. A faint shimmer, like something just beneath the surface of the water. A reflection that wasn't quite right. I turned toward it, heart racing, and saw a figure. It wasn't human, at least not entirely. Its form was indistinct, almost fluid, as though it was made of the water itself. It stared at us with hollow eyes, its face obscured by the darkness. I grabbed my friend's arm, my voice trembling. "We need to get back." We ran. Our footsteps thundered in my ears as we sprinted back to the campsite. The trees loomed over us, their branches creaking as if they were watching us too. The fire was still burning, casting flickering shadows on my friends' faces, but none of them seemed to notice our panic. That night, I couldn't sleep. The silence that had once felt peaceful now felt suffocating. I kept hearing whispers in the dark, and every time I closed my eyes I saw the figure, those hollow, watching eyes beneath the water. At dawn, I gathered my friends and told them what had happened. They didn't believe me. They dismissed it as nerves, as the strange atmosphere of the woods playing tricks on my mind. But I knew better. The figure was still out there, waiting beneath the surface of the lake, and I could still feel those hollow eyes watching me, even now. It started with a simple trip. Me and a few friends decided to rent a small lake house nestled deep in the woods. We were looking for a peaceful weekend away from the noise of city life. The house was old, wooden, surrounded by towering pines and the quiet hum of nature. We thought it would be perfect. Serene, isolated, and far from any distractions. The first night was calm. We unpacked, had a few drinks, and sat by the fire. The lake, reflecting the full moon, seemed endless and still. The wind whispered through the trees, and I could almost feel the tension from the city melt away. It felt too quiet, though, unnervingly so. But we brushed it off, telling ourselves it was just the stillness of the woods at night. It was around midnight when I woke. I'd drifted off in one of the old wooden chairs by the window. Something stirred in my dream. I sat up and rubbed my eyes. The fire had died down to glowing embers, and the room was cast in darkness. That's when I heard it. Soft tapping. I assumed it was rain, but the sky was clear. The sound came again. Light, but deliberate, like something was trying to get my attention. I turned my head toward the window, listening, expecting to see raindrops. But there was nothing there. I waited, my breath shallow, listening for whatever could be making the noise. Then, through the corner of my eye, I saw something move. Not a shadow, not a figure. It was a shape, indistinct, something that seemed out of place. I froze. My heart pounded as I scanned the dark outline of the woods outside. The trees seemed to stretch endlessly, their tops swaying in the wind. Whatever was there wasn't a part of the forest. It felt like it didn't belong. I got up slowly, every step creaking on the old wooden floor. The tapping continued, but now it wasn't just at the window. It was all around the house, soft, rhythmic, almost musical. I peered out again, my eyes straining into the night. There, in the distance, I saw it, just for a second. A figure, not human, not quite. It was tall, thin, and it moved strangely, almost like a distorted reflection of something. I stumbled backward, my hand gripping the wall. My mind raced. Was it a trick of the light? Was I imagining things? But the fear was too real. Something wasn't right. The tapping stopped. The silence that followed was deafening. I wanted to call out to my friends, but my voice wouldn't work. The air felt colder, like something had seeped into the house. Then I heard it, the voice. Soft, almost a whisper, but it carried through the room like it was right next to me. "Come outside." It wasn't coming from anywhere in the house. It was outside. The chill in my bones deepened. I felt like I was frozen, rooted to the floor. I wanted to scream, but all I could do was listen. The door creaked open on its own. I didn't remember leaving it unlocked. The figure I had seen before was now closer, just beyond the porch. It wasn't moving, just standing there, watching the house. I wanted to run, but I couldn't. My legs felt like stone. The whisper came again, sharper this time. "Let me in." I blinked, trying to comprehend what I was seeing. The figure took a step closer. It was unnatural. Wrong. Its skin was pale and stretched too thin, and its limbs moved like they weren't quite attached to its body. Panic surged through me. I forced myself to turn and sprint toward my friend's rooms. The taps on the window started again, louder, as if they were chasing me. I could feel something behind me, something that wanted to get in. I burst into their room, screaming, and dragged them from their beds. They were groggy at first, but the fear in my voice made them realize something wasn't right. We rushed out the back door, not daring to look back. The figure never followed us. We left the cabin behind, not stopping until we reached the edge of the woods where we could no longer see the house. It wasn't until hours later, as we sat in a diner miles from where we started, that I finally spoke. "I think we were followed," I said, my voice trembling. "I think something was waiting for us. None of us wanted to go back. None of us ever did." It was a crisp autumn evening when I decided to take a solo drive through the countryside. The road stretched on endlessly, flanked by trees that were shedding their leaves, casting long, eerie shadows under the fading sunlight. I always enjoyed these quiet drives, just me and the open road, away from the noise of the city. I'd taken this route countless times before, but tonight felt different. The air was thicker, almost oppressive, and I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't entirely alone out here. The road wound through rolling hills, with fields stretching far beyond the horizon. I passed a few dilapidated barns, their broken windows reflecting the golden hues of the setting sun. It was the kind of place where time seemed to have stopped, silent, isolated, and forgotten. As I drove, the familiar sound of my tires crunching over the gravel faded, replaced by a strange, distant echo, almost like footsteps following behind me. I glanced in the rearview mirror, half expecting to see someone. But there was no one, just empty road stretching out behind me. I shook my head, trying to dismiss the thought. Maybe it was just my imagination. But as I drove further, the feeling only grew stronger. It was as if someone was watching me from the shadows, waiting for the right moment to make themselves known. Eventually, I reached an old, overgrown trail leading into the woods. I couldn't help but take a detour, curious about the trees that loomed ahead. The leaves crunched beneath my tires as I ventured deeper into the forest. The air became cooler and the sounds of nature seemed to fade, leaving only silence. The trees stretched high above, their branches forming a dense canopy, blocking out the last rays of sunlight. It felt as if I had stepped into a different world, one untouched by time. I stopped the car and stepped out, taking a deep breath of the crisp, cool air. The forest felt alive in a way that made my skin crawl. The wind whispered through the trees, but there were no birdsong, no rustling of animals, just the stillness of the woods. I wandered off the trail, following a narrow footpath that seemed to beckon me deeper into the forest. Every step felt heavier, as if the trees themselves were watching, their twisted limbs casting dark shapes on the ground. Then I heard it again, the faint sound of footsteps. This time, they weren't distant or echoing. They were close, too close. I froze, my breath catching in my throat. The woods seemed to hold their breath, waiting. I slowly turned around, expecting to see something, or someone, standing behind me. But there was nothing. My heart pounded in my chest as I fought the panic rising in my throat. The silence was oppressive, broken only by the sound of my own shaky breathing. I clutched my phone tightly, turning on the flashlight. The beam cut through the darkness, illuminating the path ahead. I must have been imagining things. It had to be the isolation, the eerie quiet of the woods. I told myself that over and over, but deep down, I knew better. I retraced my steps, trying to shake off the feeling of being watched. The woods seemed to close in tighter, the path harder to see in the dim light. My flashlight flickered, then went out entirely, plunging me into darkness. I fumbled with my phone, trying to turn the flashlight back on, but it was dead. My signal had vanished, and I realized just how far I'd strayed from the main road. Panic set in. The feeling of being lost was overwhelming. The silence stretched on, broken only by the soft rustling of leaves in the wind. And then I heard it again. The footsteps. Closer this time. I could feel them behind me, just beyond the edge of my vision. I spun around, my breath hitching in my throat. Still, no one. I forced myself to walk faster, the crunching of leaves beneath my feet now sounding like whispers, like the trees themselves were speaking. The woods felt endless, as if they had no intention of letting me go. After what felt like hours, I stumbled onto an old, faded trail marker. The letters were barely legible, but I could just make out the word path etched into the wood. I followed the marker, hoping it would lead me back to my car. The silence was deafening, but at least now I had a point of reference. I kept my head down, not wanting to look behind me, where I knew something, or someone, was watching. Finally, I broke through the tree line and saw my car waiting in the distance, bathed in the faint glow of the moon. I didn't stop running until I reached it, slamming the door shut behind me. As I drove away, the weight in my chest eased, but the feeling of being followed didn't. I knew I'd be looking over my shoulder for a long time. What had been out there in the woods with me? I still don't know, and I don't think I ever want to find out. I was driving home late after finishing a long day at the plant. The road was empty, winding through hills and fields that stretched on for miles. It was one of those stretches where there's nothing but darkness, just you and the headlights cutting through the night. I preferred it that way. No distractions, no noise, just the hum of the engine and the occasional crackle of the radio. It had been a rough shift. The plant was always loud, always hot, but tonight felt different. A strange feeling had been hanging over me all day, a low, persistent unease that I couldn't shake. I kept thinking about the strange, flickering shadows that danced on the walls of the machinery room and the echoing creaks I heard whenever I moved too far away from the others. I tried not to let it get to me, but something wasn't right. The radio crackled again and I turned it down, the silence of the night settling in once more. As I drove, I noticed how still everything was. Even the usual hum of insects seemed to have disappeared. It wasn't just quiet, it was wrong. The kind of silence that makes you feel like something is waiting just beyond the edge of your vision. I passed through a stretch of trees, their branches hanging low, creating dark tunnels over the road. I glanced into the rearview mirror, half expecting to see someone, or something, following me. The mirror reflected only my car and the empty road behind me. As I came around a bend, the headlights caught something strange ahead. It wasn't a roadblock or an animal. It was a figure, standing motionless by the side of the road, wearing a long coat that blended into the night. My heart stopped for a moment. I didn't recognize the figure, and the fact that it was just standing there, perfectly still, made my stomach churn. I slowed down, my mind racing. Who would be out here at this hour? The figure didn't move, didn't flinch as my headlights illuminated it. I couldn't see any facial features, just a vague, shadowy form beneath the coat. "Hello," I called out, my voice trembling. No response. I couldn't bring myself to stop, but I slowed down, creeping past the figure. It never moved, never flinched as I passed by. My hands trembled on the steering wheel, and my pulse throbbed in my ears. I kept glancing in the rearview mirror, but the figure remained still. A mile down the road, I dared to look back again. The figure was gone. I didn't stop driving until I hit the city limits. The whole ride home, I kept replaying what I'd seen. It didn't make sense. Who, or what, stood there, unmoving, in the middle of nowhere? When I finally got home, I locked the door and turned on every light in the house, unable to shake the feeling that I wasn't alone, that something had been watching me, waiting for me to pass. I never went back to that road again. I don't think I ever will. The old barn was far from where I had ever expected to encounter anything remotely eerie. I grew up on a farm, and barns were part of life, places for animals, equipment, and nothing more. But that summer evening changed everything. It was supposed to be a simple task: check on the horses and ensure everything was secure before nightfall. My family had always kept the barn in good shape, but this one had been abandoned for years, unused since my grandfather had passed. Most of the time, we avoided going near it. Something about the way it loomed in the distance always made my skin crawl. I remember walking across the overgrown fields, the tall grass brushing against my legs as the sun dipped low, casting long shadows across the landscape. The barn sat a few hundred feet away, its wooden frame creaking slightly in the breeze. I had to see if the horses were okay, even though I didn't like the way the air felt around it. The moment I stepped inside, the silence was overwhelming. Dust floated in the slanting light that seeped through a broken roof panel. It was strange. Everything was as I remembered. But there was something else, a smell. Musty and old, but beneath that, something faintly metallic. I couldn't place it. As I moved deeper into the barn, the air grew colder, biting at my skin. The sound of my footsteps echoed unnaturally. The faint noise of hooves clattering against the wooden floor, like they were dancing, tapping in a pattern I couldn't quite make sense of. It didn't belong to the horses. I stopped. My breath misted in the stillness as I strained to listen. The clattering continued, but now it seemed further away, like something was moving deeper into the barn. I wasn't sure if it was my imagination, but the shadows appeared to shift, bending in ways they shouldn't have. They seemed alive, writhing like dark tendrils, stretching longer than they should in the dim light. Something was watching. I called out to the horses, but the silence swallowed my voice. There was no response, only the distant clattering sound that was now getting closer. I could feel the cold radiating off the wooden beams, seeping into my bones. That's when I saw it. At the far end of the barn, barely illuminated by the fading light, a figure stood motionless. It wasn't human, at least not entirely. Its shape was twisted, distorted, and though its face was obscured, I could feel the weight of its gaze. The shadows surrounding it seemed to pulse, shifting like a living thing, as if the figure controlled them. I couldn't move. My body refused to obey as I stared at it. The clattering had stopped, replaced by an unsettling silence that felt as though it was waiting for something. A chill ran through me, colder than the night air. Then the figure began to move toward me, slowly, deliberately. The floor groaned under its steps, as if the very wood resisted its presence. Its form twisted again, contorting unnaturally. The shadows seemed to cling to it, as though they were a part of it, not separate. I wanted to scream, to run, but my legs felt frozen. The figure stopped just a few feet away, the silence stretching between us. I could feel its cold breath on my skin, but there was no sound. Suddenly, it raised a hand, not to harm, but in a slow, deliberate motion, as if asking for something I couldn't give. The shadows extended toward me, and for a moment, I thought they might consume me. But then, as quickly as it appeared, the figure turned and vanished into the deeper shadows of the barn. I stood there, trembling, until the cold became unbearable. My legs finally moved, carrying me out of the barn, back into the open field. I didn't look back. The barn stood silent, as though nothing had ever disturbed its stillness. But something had. It was a lazy Sunday afternoon when I decided to explore the old, deserted factory on the outskirts of town. I'd always been fascinated by abandoned places, the rusted machinery, the echoing silence. There was something eerie about them, like the memories of what once thrived inside lingered, waiting to be disturbed. The factory was massive, with crumbling walls and broken windows letting in streaks of sunlight. Most of the machinery was old and covered in dust, but it was still intact enough to give me a glimpse of what it must have been like in its prime. I wandered through the halls, the sound of my footsteps echoing off the empty concrete. At first, everything seemed normal, almost serene, but there was a subtle, underlying feeling of tension. It felt like I wasn't alone, though I couldn't hear or see anyone. My heart picked up a little, but I brushed it off. Abandoned buildings always gave off that vibe. As I made my way deeper inside, I found a room filled with old filing cabinets and paperwork, scattered haphazardly. Some of the papers were faded and barely legible, but I noticed a few that seemed out of place. They were newer, clean, bright white as if they'd been recently added. Curious, I thumbed through the stack, finding scribbled notes and numbers, mostly unintelligible. One note caught my eye. It read, "They're still here." I froze. My skin crawled. The factory was silent except for the faint creaking of old machinery shifting. The words felt out of place, disturbing. Who could have written this? And how could they be still here when there was no sign of life? I was about to leave when I heard it. A faint whispering, barely audible but unmistakable. I stood still, straining to listen. The whispering grew louder, like 1,000 voices murmuring all at once. It was coming from deeper inside the factory, where the shadows were darkest. The whispers seemed to call my name, though I couldn't make out the exact words. My breath caught as I felt something brush past my leg. I jumped back, heart pounding, but there was nothing. Just the cold air and the oppressive silence. I wanted to run, but something inside held me in place. My curiosity had always been my downfall. I forced myself to keep moving, stepping further into the factory. The whispers turned into faint guttural murmurs, almost like someone speaking in a language I couldn't understand. That's when I saw it, a figure standing at the end of a long corridor. It wasn't moving, just standing there, silent. I couldn't make out its face, just a vague, shadowy shape. My stomach churned. The whispers turned into a low, rhythmic chanting. I didn't know how long I stood there, frozen, staring at the figure. It felt like time had stopped, the only sounds being the chanting and my own frantic heartbeat. Then, suddenly, it moved, slowly, deliberately. I couldn't tell if it was coming toward me or standing still, but as it took a step, I noticed the shadows in the room growing darker, shifting unnaturally like they were alive. I turned to run, but my legs wouldn't respond. The chanting grew louder, overwhelming, and then silence. Complete, deafening silence. The whispers had stopped, but something was wrong. So wrong. I was hyper-aware of my surroundings now, every creak and groan of the factory amplifying in my ears. The figure was gone. The hallway was empty. I stumbled back toward the entrance, my breath coming in shallow gasps. As I reached the door, I turned around one last time. The factory was still as death, the machinery still and lifeless. But through one of the broken windows, I swear I saw something. A shadow, far off in the distance, just standing there, watching. I don't know what I saw, or who, or what was there with me. I left the factory that day, and I've never gone back. I'm not sure if whatever was there ever really left. It was an ordinary day, or so I thought. My family had decided to spend the weekend at a nearby lake, a place we used to visit years ago when I was a child. I remember the crisp air, the sound of the water gently lapping at the shore, and the quiet seclusion. It was the perfect escape from the chaos of everyday life. We arrived in the late afternoon, the sun sinking low in the sky. My parents unpacked the car while my siblings and I ran toward the water. The familiar smell of pine and damp earth filled the air, and for a while everything felt calm and peaceful. We fished off the dock, laughed, and swam in the cool, clear water. As the sun began to set, we decided to set up camp near the lake. My dad had brought a tent, and we found a spot far from the main area surrounded by thick trees. The fire crackled softly, and we roasted marshmallows and shared stories. It was exactly what we needed, a break from the noise and stress. Around midnight, my parents decided it was time to turn in. I stayed by the fire, wanting to soak in the stillness of the night for just a little longer. The firelight flickered against the trees, casting long shadows. The only sounds were the gentle lapping of the water and the occasional rustle of leaves. I must have dozed off, because the next thing I knew, I was awake and shivering. The fire had burned down to glowing embers, leaving only faint traces of warmth. The forest around me was silent, but there was something off. I sat up, stretching my arms. The air felt colder than before, and there was a strange stillness, like the whole world had stopped breathing. I glanced at the tree line, expecting to see the familiar shape of the tent, but it was gone. In its place was only darkness. At first, I thought maybe my family had gone for a walk or stepped away from the camp, but something didn't feel right. I called out their names, my voice swallowed by the stillness. No response. I stood up, my heart hammering. The night was pitch black, with only the faint glow of the stars to guide me. My breath fogged in the cold air, and the oppressive silence wrapped around me like a heavy blanket. I tried to stay calm, telling myself they were just nearby, maybe searching for firewood or exploring. I made my way toward the tree line, stepping cautiously over the uneven ground. The woods seemed endless, the trees towering above me, their branches twisting in strange, unnatural shapes. The silence grew louder with every step I took. It wasn't until I stumbled across something that I stopped cold, a trail of small bare footprints in the dirt. They were tiny, almost childlike, but there were no children in our group. I followed them for a few steps before the unease turned to terror. The footprints led away from our camp, toward the deeper parts of the forest. "Mom? Dad? Sam? Emma?" I called again, my voice breaking. My knees felt weak as I followed the trail, the strange prints leading me further into the trees. The silence was deafening, and every creak of the branches overhead seemed like it was drawing closer. Finally, I stumbled upon something, a faint light, not from the stars or the moon, but from a source deeper in the woods. It flickered like a distant candle. My stomach sank as I moved closer, my pulse quickening. What I found made my skin crawl. A clearing opened up ahead, and there, in the middle of it, was a figure standing perfectly still. It was cloaked in shadows, its features obscured by the darkness, but I could feel its presence, like something ancient and otherworldly. I froze, unable to look away. The figure didn't move, didn't react, but I could feel its gaze upon me. I wanted to turn and run, but my legs wouldn't cooperate. Suddenly, the figure tilted its head as if examining me. A sharp, dry crack echoed through the forest as it took a slow step forward. I could hear my breath, shallow and ragged, as I watched in silent horror. Then, just as quickly as it appeared, the figure was gone. The light flickered once more and vanished into the darkness. Tears blurred my vision as I turned and ran. The forest seemed endless, but I didn't care. All I wanted was to get back to the camp, back to some sense of safety. I didn't stop until I could see the faint glow of the remaining embers from the fire. When I got there, I found my family. They were unharmed, asleep in the tent as if nothing had happened. They had no memory of waking up in the middle of the night, no memory of wandering into the woods, as if time had folded and they hadn't been touched by whatever had stalked me. To this day, I don't know what I saw, what followed me through those woods. All I know is that I haven't returned to that place. The memories still haunt me, and every time I hear the sound of silence, I'm reminded of that night, when something far beyond explanation walked in the shadows. It was an ordinary Saturday morning when my friends and I decided to take a trip out to an old lake tucked away from civilization. We were looking for something remote, peaceful, a way to escape the noise of daily life. The drive was long, and as we got further from the city, the landscape changed from paved roads to dusty trails and towering trees. The lake itself was beautiful, serene, surrounded by dense forest. We'd read about it online, something about its still, clear waters and the promise of tranquility. The plan was simple: hike around the lake, find a nice spot to set up camp, and spend the day swimming, fishing, and lounging by the shore. When we arrived, we were the only ones there. It felt like we had the entire lake to ourselves, the kind of solitude you only find when you're far away from everything. We unpacked our gear and set up camp, the sound of birds and the rustling of leaves the only things breaking the silence. As the sun dipped lower and the air cooled, we went to the shore to relax. The lake was calm, the water reflecting the orange glow of the sunset. We joked and laughed, tossing pebbles into the water, the sound echoing in the stillness of the woods. It was the kind of peace we'd all been craving. But that peace didn't last. It started with a noise, a distant, hollow thump. At first, I didn't think much of it. Maybe it was an animal or just the wind carrying strange sounds from deeper in the forest. But as the evening wore on, the thumping became more distinct, more deliberate. It wasn't fading away either. It seemed to be getting closer. I glanced at my friends, their faces mirroring my unease. None of us said anything at first, not wanting to ruin the atmosphere. But the thumps persisted, and now I could hear something else. Soft whispers, barely audible, carried on the breeze. The hairs on the back of my neck stood up. One of my friends, Sam, broke the silence. "Did you guys hear that?" We all nodded, uneasy. The sound was closer now. Too close. It wasn't just in the distance anymore. It was almost as if whatever was making those sounds was right there, just out of sight. We tried to convince ourselves it was probably an animal, maybe a deer or some other forest creature. But whatever it wasn't leaving. The thumping was steady, relentless, and the whispers felt like they were growing louder. "Let's go check it out," Sam suggested, his voice trembling slightly. None of us were particularly eager, but curiosity outweighed our fear. We gathered our flashlights and followed the sound deeper into the woods. The trees became denser, the air cooler, and the silence seemed to press in on us. The whispers were unmistakable now, low and guttural, spoken in a language I couldn't recognize. It was almost like they were speaking directly into my head, as if they knew I could hear them. Suddenly, the thumping stopped. The forest became eerily still again, and for a moment I thought we'd lost whatever had been making the noise. But then, just as I was about to speak, I heard it, the sound of footsteps. Not ours. These steps were slow, deliberate, and there were far too many of them. We stopped in our tracks, shining our flashlights into the trees, but there was nothing. No one there. Yet the footsteps continued, growing louder, as though they were circling us, closing in. Then, out of the corner of my flashlight beam, I saw them. Shadows, dozens of them, moving through the trees. They weren't human, not exactly. More like distorted shapes, figures with no faces, no features, just black voids where they should have been. They didn't run. They glided through the forest with an unnatural, fluid grace. We couldn't speak. We couldn't move. The shadows drew closer, closing the space between us. I could feel their presence, their gaze upon us, even though there was nothing to see. It was as if they were pulling us in, whispering promises of silence and darkness. The forest seemed to breathe, the trees swaying gently as if they too were part of whatever was watching us. I felt as though I was being drawn towards something beyond comprehension. Then, as suddenly as they appeared, the shadows vanished, leaving only silence. We stood there, frozen in place, the echoes of their whispers still ringing in my ears. It wasn't until we realized that the lake, once visible through the trees, was no longer in sight. We had wandered too far into the woods, far from where we had set up camp. Panic set in as we realized we were lost, but deep down, I knew whatever had followed us would never leave, at least not entirely. I had always been fascinated by the old house at the end of the street. It was a place I passed every day on my way home from school, its faded, peeling paint and overgrown yard standing out from the otherwise ordinary suburban neighborhood. No one lived there, or at least no one who was ever seen. The house seemed to exist in a quiet, unsettling limbo, untouched by time. One day, I found myself walking past it again, the sun sinking low behind the horizon. Curiosity got the better of me, and before I knew it, I found myself at the front gate. The rusted hinges creaked as I pushed it open, the weight of years shifting as the gate groaned in protest. I stepped into the yard, the grass crunching beneath my feet. The house loomed in front of me, its windows dark and lifeless. I had always heard stories about that house, whispers of strange sounds, of lights that flickered in the night, of shadows that moved in the windows when no one was supposed to be there. But I never believed in such things, at least not until that day. I approached the front door, the air thick with dust and the faint smell of decay. I placed my hand on the doorknob, but it didn't turn. The door was locked. I sighed, feeling a twinge of disappointment, and stepped back. But then I noticed something. Movement from one of the upstairs windows. A shadow, shifting, just for a moment. It wasn't the wind. It was too deliberate, too human. My heart began to race. I told myself it was probably just a trick of the light, something my mind conjured up in the dim twilight. But I couldn't shake the feeling that someone, or something, was watching me. Despite my better judgment, I approached the side of the house, creeping closer to a window that was partially cracked open. The boards covering it were old and warped, barely hanging on. I pressed my face to the opening, peering inside. The room beyond was dark, but I could make out the outlines of furniture, ancient, covered in dust. A faint glimmer of something metallic caught my eye, resting on a table. Suddenly, a low creak echoed from somewhere inside the house, and I jumped back, heart pounding. My breath quickened as I stepped away from the window, the realization hitting me that I wasn't alone. The silence seemed to stretch, heavy and oppressive, pressing down on me. I had to get out, but just as I turned to leave, I heard a faint whisper, barely audible, as if it was coming from inside the house. "Stay." I froze, my blood running cold. The whisper wasn't a voice I recognized. It wasn't human. It was hollow, almost robotic, like something long forgotten had spoken from beyond the grave. A shiver ran down my spine. My feet felt frozen to the ground. I wanted to run, but something kept me rooted in place. The whisper came again, louder this time. "Stay." I clenched my fists, forcing myself to take a step back. I wanted to scream, but my voice felt caught in my throat. My mind was screaming at me to leave, but my body wouldn't move. I could feel the air grow heavier, darker, as though the house itself had become alive, watching me, waiting. Then, just as suddenly as the whispers had started, they stopped. The silence was deafening. I waited, my heart racing, my breaths shallow, trying to convince myself it was over. I turned, finally running, sprinting down the street, my mind replaying the voice in my head. I never went back to that house. To this day, I still wonder what was in there, what was waiting. But some things are better left untouched, hidden away, behind doors that should never be opened.